Hi guys, this is Hirosaki. This story is all about what if Naruto was entrusted with a legendary gift. When Naruto is given a gift considered legendary even in a world where walking on water is a daily occurrence for some, will it lead him on a path towards peace, or will the consequences of said gift leave a hole in his heart too large to fill? Before we start, kindly like and subscribe to this channel, and look over the description box for the author of this amazing storyline. Welcome aboard. Chapter 30, Water 6. In a lifeless area of Mizu no Kuni, surrounded by destroyed trees and burnt-out foliage, the mists were particularly thick. The sun was setting over the horizon, casting an eerie orange glow through the dense fog. The air was bitingly cold, evidenced by the layer of frost coating everything. It was always like this in March for the residents of Mizu no Kuni, and most had gotten used to it. Of course, that didn't make the complaints of one Kirigakure shinobi any quieter, as he and his companion made their normal routes through the deforested area surrounding their base. I mean, seriously? Do you think it would cost them that much to spring for some warmer flak jackets? The man was fairly young, barely out of his teens, with messy light blue hair falling about the sides of his face, only kept out of his eyes by his headband. He wore the standard Kiri uniform complete with the dark navy flak jacket with protruding shoulder guards. Shut it. His companion, a much older and more grizzled man with a scar running across his face diagonally, was in a much less talkative mood. But then again, I guess some warm scarves or something might do as well, just something to keep the frost out, you know. The younger man walked out in front, his hands up behind his head as he glanced about, only using the minimum awareness for his surroundings. They had made this route countless times before, and had never seen hide nor hair of any rebels. They were far too deep in their own territory. Shut it. The younger man simply ignored his companion. The man never said much other than to try and get him to be quiet, and not in particularly nice ways. Today was a good day, he hadn't been threatened him yet, so he planned on enjoying it while it lasted. You'd think if Mizukage-sama wanted us at our best to beat those bloodline freaks, he would at least want us to stay warm, right? The man walked on a few more paces before blinking in surprise. It was rare for his fellow shinobi to simply ignore his inane ramblings. He put his arms down at his side as he turned, frowning slightly at the change from the norm. However, he was instantly on alert when he saw the man was nowhere in sight, the mists seeming slightly stronger than normal. Hey Kuru. Slowly he began to reach for his kunai pouch, eyes darting about to spot anything in the all-too-oppressive mists. He was too late though. One moment he was standing and holding his kunai, the next he was buried up to his neck in the ground. He managed to notice that it was oddly soft, like sand, before he felt something tap his forehead and his world went dark. Well, that was surprisingly easy. Naruto wiped a stray bang out of his face as he replaced his shikujas safely on his back. In the few months since the incident on the summoning island, he had allowed it to grow out quite a bit. He hadn't exactly had time to get it cut. His spiky ponytail was beginning to reach his shoulder blades, and the bangs around his face had begun falling over his headband in a rather irritating way. Shizuku had told him it made him appear more handsome, but Naruto merely though it was distracting. Did you expect anything else? A green blur dropped down beside him, revealing itself to be Fo. Like him, her hair had also grown out, now touching her shoulders. Both had rather surprising growth spurts recently, now standing at 5'2" and 5'1" respectively. The most noticeable change though was Fo no longer wore her bright white outfit, instead opting for darker navy and gray tones to better camouflage with the mists. I suppose not. How do you think Shizuku and Chojuro are doing with theirs? Fo just raised an eyebrow at the monk, to which he just waved her off with a slightly irritated expression. Don't be like that, I'm allowed to worry about her, okay? To be honest, he had no real reason to be worried about Shizuku. Chojuro was strong by his own rights, but that wasn't to say the Violet couldn't take care of herself. The last few months had certainly been interesting for the trio. After leaving Anoka, they had sought out the rebels. It hadn't been hard. Thanks to Naruto's near-perfect memory, he had been able to spot more than a few of their camp positions with that single glance into their command tent. It had taken a few tries due to them moving about, but eventually they had tracked a group down. They of course were suspicious at first, as they had a right to be, but that was soon sorted out. "Look, we don't mean you any harm, we merely wish to offer our help." The tall rebel shinobi simply looked down at the shorter blonde. A guarded eye drifting to his two female companions stood behind him. "Aha, and I should believe you're not spies, why? How was it you were able to find our camp?" "That's not exactly something that makes me drop my guard." Naruto looked around, noticing they were drawing the attention of a few more shinobi around them. "I told you, Nezumiro told me how to find you guys if I ever decided to help." It was a lie, but he thought the alternative sounded far more suspicious, and was likely to end up with them in custody. "How do you know the name of Maisama's cousin?" Naruto just sighed, resisting the urge to rest his head in his palm. He knew these people had a right to be wary in order to preserve their secrecy, but this was becoming ridiculous, bordering on paranoid. "Look, I said." Suddenly a shout cut through any other conversation going on as everybody turned to look at the speeding orange blur that many of the rebels recognized. Naruto-kun. The blonde only had time to widen his eyes before being tackled to the ground in an undignified heap. If he didn't know for sure she was standing right behind him, he would have sworn it was Shizuko. However, when he looked up, he was staring straight into a pair of sparkling emerald eyes, framed by burnt orange hair. "Nezumiro?" Naruto smiled fondly at the memory. During their time helping the rebellion, Nezumiro had become a good friend. Among the bleak realities of war, and the even drearier climate of Mizu no Kuni in winter, she was like a perpetual ray of light. There was literally nothing that ever kept her down for long, not even her injury that had her only doing light exercise until recently. Even now she wasn't allowed to go out on any missions until she was back to her old self again, but that didn't stop her from getting the occasional spar out of Naruto or Fu, and sometimes even Shizuku. That was another big surprise. Shizuku had finally mastered the second stage of the water chakra exercises. After that, she had begun to soak up water ninjutsu like a sponge. All the rebels who taught her were just astounded by the rate she picked them up. Not only that, but she could use them even when there wasn't any nearby source of water, drawing the moisture straight from the air. The mists helped, but even so, some of the best water specialists in the rebellion couldn't do that. Apparently, it was comparable to Kisame Hashigake or the Nidaime Hokage. Either way, she had become quite the combatant, but had never lost her innocent personality. Even now, after months of helping the rebels, she was loath to hurt people, taking on Naruto's mantra of suppression as opposed to killing. Most of the time she would use a special technique she had developed in order to painlessly suffocate her target, knocking them out. She had nearly broken down crying the first time she used it outside of a spar, but luckily Naruto was there to calm her down. He still remembered the shock he got when they had first discovered her latent abilities. Shizuka stood firm at the center of a training ground, her hands up in the taijutsu stance Naruto had been teaching her. With the discovery of her amazing water affinity, Naruto had decided to try and teach her one of his styles in the hopes that she could use it. Technically, his Mizu no Mai should be useless to anybody other than him due to it requiring his Preta Path ability. However, Naruto didn't want Shizuko to get hurt, and it was his second most evasive style behind the Kaze no Mai, but she lacked the training in wind-natured chakra for that. "So you know what to do, right?" The violet nodded to the young monk, taking a deep breath as her eyes focused. Naruto gave her a moment to prepare before rushing in, starting off with a standard jab to her stomach. He was only going at half his regular speed, so that the girl had a chance to warm up to the stances in an actual combat situation as opposed to simply running through the kata. To his satisfaction, Shizuka skillfully swerved to one side, rolling with the motion until they were back to back. Before he could lash out with his other hand, she dropped down, pushing off with her hands to skid between his parted legs. At the same time, she had already begun to turn, hoping to remove Naruto's base by sliding his legs out from under him. The blonde jumped up in time to avoid it, but was forced back again as Shizuka completed the motion by thrusting up, keeping her hands on the ground to come up spinning with her legs in a perfect split. Naruto smiled as he leant back underneath the kicks, he had added a few more offensive moves to her kata to make up for the lack of his ability. "That's good, Shizuku." The violet preened under the praise as she landed back on her feet, throwing her head back to let her hair fall into place behind her. Like Fu, she had undergone a change of wardrobe, but not as drastic. She had altered the colors of her kimono top and hakama to light blue and purple respectively to better blend in with the surroundings. At the same time, it had the effect of making her opponents underestimate her, while in fact the clothes gave her a surprising range of movement. "Try it again, this time with what we've been practicing." The girl nodded firmly as they rushed back together, meeting in what onlookers might have mistaken for some kind of high-speed dance. Their bodies twisted around one another in increasingly complex maneuvers in order to try and pin or bring down the other. Of course, Naruto wasn't going full out, but that wasn't the purpose of the training. Naruto had thought Shizuku might be able to compensate for her lack of his Preta path by circulating water chakra throughout her body. It had been an idea he himself had toyed with, but in practice it proved to be too difficult to simultaneously focus on that, the moves themselves, and his chakra absorption technique. He figured Shizuku shouldn't have the same handicap with only two things to focus on. The idea was to use the water chakra flowing through the body in order to increase one's flexibility, sometimes to almost ridiculous degrees. It also acted as a shock absorber, carrying the impacts through the body and dispersing the energy more economically. Naruto smirked as he saw an opening in Shizuku's form. She had overextended on the last move instead of flowing through to the next kata, and he decided to point out the mistake. He turned on one foot, using chakra to increase the friction and turn faster, and intended to give her a light tap on the shoulder. However, his eyes widened when instead, his hand simply passed straight through the girl, her body parting like a liquid around his hand. When they parted again, the two looked at each other in shock. The Kiri ninja, who had been watching them out of boredom, didn't fare much better. It had taken quite a bit of explaining, but eventually they had discovered that it was a jutsu developed by the Huzuki clan called the hydrification technique. It involved them literally turning their body parts into water, maintained and held in shape by their chakra. The only thing that confused the rebels was the fact that it was only usable by a Huzuki, not only due to their high water affinities, but their unique genetic makeup, making it something on the border between clan specialty and Kekkai Genkai. Not only that, but the only remaining Huzuki clan member had disappeared not too long after his brother had died a few months beforehand. This finally confirmed it for Naruto and Fu. Later on, they had taken Shizuku aside and explained to her what they had found in that base back in Ta no Kuni. At first, she was simply disbelieving. After all, few could take the fact they are a genetic clone of an extinct Kirigakure clan member with genes from the Nidaime Hokage spliced in. At least it explained where her absurdly powerful water affinity came from. It had taken a few days, but Naruto had managed to get through to Shizuku again, comforting her as she came to terms with that. The worst blow was probably the fact she had no real parents. She was more of a creation, an experiment, than a human being. It had taken a while for Naruto to get that concept out of her head, to convince her that she was just as human as he was. That had been the first night the two spent together, just lying next to one another and enjoying the company. Since then, they had slept in the same bed every night aside from the ones where they were on separate missions, but those were rare. At first their responsibilities were mostly guarding various cargo movements as they went between the various camps for resupplies. Naruto was okay with that. Most of the time they went by undisturbed, and the only problems they had come across was the occasional ambush from loyalists. Luckily, due to Naruto's ability to scout ahead with his sand, those were quickly turned on their heads, not expecting the rebels to know about the ambush ahead of time. He had earned quite the reputation amongst the rebels for his refusal to kill anybody, yet still always managing to deal with all his opponents. There was also his unique skills that never failed to catch the enemy off guard. Most useful was his ability to increase the gravity in a specific area, which he was slowly controlling better and better with each passing day. It sometimes allowed him to completely negate fights entirely, something greatly appreciated by the rebels as it saved them valuable supplies and lives. Of course, nobody knew where his skills came from. He had yet to tell a soul about his Rinnegan. It wasn't that he didn't trust the rebels, far from it, he had made more than a few friends amongst the younger shinobi. It was simply the fact he couldn't risk word getting out about a Rinnegan user wandering the elemental nations. It would bring a lot of attention on him and his friends. So far, the only people outside of his group that knew were Nezumiro and her Aunt May, due to her letting it slip by accident, one of the reasons Naruto was so cautious to tell anybody else. Thankfully, the buxom leader of the rebellion was very understanding of Naruto's situation, at least after she had gotten over her excitement at seeing a legendary Dojutsu. Naruto smiled again at the memory of the normally mature and powerful leader acting like a giddy schoolgirl. She understood all too well the feeling of not wanting a bloodline to come to light in fear of how it may affect one's loved ones. In that way all the bloodline clans fighting the Mizukage could relate. It was the very reason they were fighting the injustice in the first place. He also couldn't be certain, but Naruto suspected Ao knew as well. He didn't think May had told anybody else, but he had seen the older man give him curious and penetrating looks on occasion. He was never too far from May's side, and sometimes even when Naruto wasn't in the same room, he felt Ao's gaze on him. It was highly disconcerting, but other than that Naruto found the man to be very competent, if not slightly stuck in the past. Although it did make for some amusing situations when May seemingly misheard him. Since then, Naruto and his friends had gone on increasingly important missions for the rebels. It was anything from sabotage of buildings to ambushing supply caravans similar to the very ones he had been protecting not long before. Really, it was anything in order to cripple or slow down Yagura's forces, mostly guerrilla tactics that would hit hard and fast before leaving without a trace. It was something Naruto had quite the knack for due to his exceptional stealth skills. Many of the rebels were still completely amazed at how easily he could move undetected. It helped he hadn't told anybody about his Boidogakure technique. That led up to here, where he and another group of rebels were slowly surrounding a large facility fairly deep into the loyalist territory, but more importantly, dangerously close to Kirigakure itself. It was one of the largest missions he had been on, involving a hefty chunk of the rebel forces. If this mission went wrong, then they would suffer some serious losses, something Naruto would try to avoid at all costs. He had spent too long fighting alongside the rebels to see them fail, when they were just beginning to see a change in the tide of the war. "Are we ready to go?" The blonde looked up at Fu with a smile. Despite his best attempts, Fu hadn't really cracked from her usual expressionless persona. He had thought being around people would make her loosen up and learn to trust people other than him and Shizuku. It seemed to have the opposite effect. The mint-haired girl hung close to him even more than before. He couldn't tell if he was intimidated by the others, or was simply reminded of her time in Taki. "I think so." The young monk placed his hand on ground, palm flat against the damp ground. He took a deep breath as he spread his chakra through the soil, converting it slowly into sand that he could use. After around a minute he finally opened his eyes, a small smile briefly playing over his lips. He looked up, noticing that Fu had been conversing with a few insects as well. "I count 20 guards outside, 56 prisoners. I can't tell what's happening inside the buildings though." Fu was quiet for a moment before nodded slowly, agreeing with the estimate. Not only had Naruto's Deva Path skills improved over the last few months, but his ability to control sand. Specifically, his ability to sense people's chakra through the sand as long as they were in contact with it. Right now, he had a very thin layer spread out across the entire facility. Every time anybody took a step on the ground he knew where they were exactly. It was exceedingly useful for reconnaissance and information gathering, vital aspects of warfare. Ao-san was correct then. Naruto just nodded. Ao had an uncanny ability to scout places out. Nobody even knew how he did it, even though Naruto suspected it had something to do with the eye underneath his patch. When he had asked about it though, the irritable man had simply told him to mind his own business. When he had asked others, they could only tell him he lost it during his time as the head of the Kiri Hunter-nin branch of their ANBU. "Are you ready?" Fu paused for a moment before nodding once, the two suddenly disappearing in a blur of motion. The loyalist facility was oddly quiet for such a large compound. usually there would be the sound of the guards idly chatting or the groans and various pleas of the prisoners, quickly ended by the guards kicking the cages. However, tonight it was almost silent, an odd aura hung in the air that had many of the guards on edge. It was one of those sixth senses you gain from spending too long fighting. Something was going to happen tonight, but nobody knew what. It was officially a prison, in reality though it was simply a large collection of cages where any captured bloodline holders were kept until they could be safely transported to more secure locations. Numerous chakra-suppressing seals lined the long series of cages, making sure anybody held inside wouldn't even have the strength to stand. The prisoners were grouped together in 4s or 5s, left in whatever clothes they had been captured in, regardless of condition. The loyalists were indiscriminate about who they captured, women, children, non-combatants. That didn't matter if they had a Kekkei Genkai or spoke out against the Mizukage. The only noise that broke through the silence was the soft crunch of the guards' sandals against the frosty ground as they made their patrols. Of course, none of them noticed as the ground beneath their feet grew ever so slightly softer. It all happened in an instant. The guards never stood a chance as the ground itself suddenly rose up to swallow them all. From the wall of the facility, Naruto crouched down, his body cloaked to both eyes and sensors alike as he held out his hand. It took a lot of concentration for him to manipulate the sand so finely to capture multiple targets like this. Finally, though it was over, all of the guards lay on the ground, cocooned in a layer of tough, chakra-enhanced sand that covered their mouths before they even got a chance to cry out. Moments later, multiple blurs appeared within the compound's walls, dashing across to the cages as fast as they could. Those prisoners that were still awake and not on the verge of unconsciousness due to hunger or dehydration were able to spot around 10 Kiri shinobi. Fu, Shizuku and Chojuro were among them while Naruto stayed in his position, keeping the guards restrained while watching out for reinforcements. They had to be fast. One downside of his ability was that he was unable to deconstruct concrete or other more sturdy building materials into sand. That meant he was unable to see what was going on inside the buildings, no doubt used as barracks for the guards posted at the facility. That was why all the shinobi selected were able to use water ninjutsu to a high degree, so they could all silently slice off the locks on the cages with a bastardized version of Taki's water-cutting sword that only surrounded the user's hand. Once the prisoners were free, they went about quickly handing out food and water, enough so that they would have the energy to make it back behind their own lines. The rebels had made a great effort to push forward in the past few months, and the contested zones had now reached the area around Kirigakure no Sato itself, towards the more southern region of the country. It was no secret that the loyalists were beginning to feel the strain. Yagura had no allies, no backing from the daimyo or any higher power. He only had the powers at his disposal, namely the village itself. While they could produce their own weapons, and had a steady supply of food for their forces, they lacked long-term financial stability. With the civil war taking up most of his attention, Kiri's income had taken a serious blow, what with the fact they had lost many jobs and clients due to their abhorrent regime. The rebels on the other hand had a few allies in the smaller countries, backing them in hopes that when they won against the loyalists it would put them in good favor when Kiri returned to full power. In the last few months, with the great progress they had made pushing south, they had more time to allocate their forces on missions for money and funding. It also greatly helped that they controlled most of the northern and western ports that connected Mizu no Kuni with the rest of the continent. Naruto watched as the stronger of the prisoners, the ones that had been incarcerated most recently, carried the weaker or younger ones on their backs, the shinobi that had arrived to rescue them doing the same. Naruto would have offered his assistance with sand stretchers, but right now it was taking his full concentration just to keep the guards restrained. Luckily, they were being knocked out one by Fu. With each that stopped struggling, Naruto felt his control increase. A small smile couldn't help but play upon his lips as he watched the prisoners get evacuated. If they were in good enough health, the rebels had gained a few more shinobi for the fight. If they weren't, then they had saved many people from an unfavorable fate. Either way they won. The benefit to the rebellion, being mainly bloodline clans, was that every person fighting was a huge benefit. It was sometimes unfair to say, but most often true, that a shinobi with a bloodline was usually worth 3 or 4 regular ninja, as they took less training to be just as useful. The main downside to them was simply they were more limited in what they could learn compared to other ninja. Naruto stayed behind for a few minutes, making sure that nobody in the buildings realized what had happened before the rest had time to get away. They should have timed it so they caught the guards right after a shift change, giving them ample time to get away. However, an error like that could have cost them the entire mission, not to mention all of those prisoners' lives. After 5 minutes, Naruto figured that was enough time, his body quickly vanishing into the surrounding night to rejoin with his comrades. There would be a lot of celebrating back at the camp that night. A single shinobi jogged through dimly lit white corridors, the walls having a small sheen of moisture from the mist hanging in the air outside. His sandal-clad feet made rhythmic thumping sounds against the clean tiled floor. He didn't look left or right, already knowing exactly where he was going. The woman by the door didn't even look up as he passed. He had been there so many times before it had become practically routine. Stopping and straightening up, he caught his breath for a moment. He knew his leader hated it when his shinobi appeared out of breath. It was a sign of weakness. The Mizukage did not tolerate weakness in his ranks. As per procedure, he knocked 3 times on the door, calmly waiting for the call for him to enter. When he heard it, he straightened his uniform before carefully opening the door. His leader had been in a rather bad mood lately, and it wasn't unheard of for messengers to be met with kunai upon entering. Luckily for him, the Mizukage had his back to the door, staring out of the large panoramic window that looked out over Kirigakure. In the waning hours of the day, when the moon had begun its ascent into the sky, the village was often cast into an almost ethereal glow. The moisture clinging to the clean white walls of the cylindrical buildings reflected the pale moonlight which was captured by the mist, creating an almost mystical scene. The streets themselves were completely barren of life, as if the whole village was abandoned. Of course, everybody was simply inside due to the curfew. What is it? The Mizukage didn't bother turning in his chair. There was no need for him to see the people giving him messages. If they had gotten that far into the village, then they were either an exceptional spy or just another of his subordinates. One way they left without hassle, the other, they didn't leave at all. There was a reason he was the Yonde Mizukage. Report from the bloodline holding facility. Mizukage-sama, if the shinobi was a lesser man, he might have stuttered in the presence of such a powerful man that could kill him in the blink of the eye, especially with the information he was giving him. Well then, place it on the desk and leave. The shinobi gave a curt nod, knowing that his leader could see it in the reflection of the window. He cautiously set the manila folder on the large opulent mahogany desk, careful not to disturb the files and papers already neatly stacked there. With it, he gave another quick nod before retreating from the room without another sound. As the door closed, the large swivel chair slowly turned with a creak, revealing the man sat there. He was surprisingly short for one who cast such an intimidating aura, the light grayish hair also contrasting that image. Otherwise, the man could have been mistaken for a teenager, although the stitched scar running down from his left eye told that he had seen battles. Much of his body was cast into shadow from the moonlight streaming into the room from behind him, but his cold pink eyes were perfectly visible in the shadows his hair cast. Slowly he leafed through the report, his hand slowly tightening into a fist as he read more. Calmly he placed it down and stood from the chair, walking leisurely to the window where he stood, just looking out over his village. To one side a large staff leaned against the wall, on one end what appeared to be a large flower, while on the other a curled hook. For a while he simply stared out over the village, his eyes narrowed slightly, before he took a deep breath and closed his eyes. Very well then, I believe I have humored Terumi's little rebellion for long enough. Chapter 31, Water 7. 3 cloaked figures flickered into a small clearing, the slim crescent moon overhead barely illuminating their surroundings. It was only training and reflexes that allowed them to navigate the treacherous ground, especially with the hazy fog covering the ground around their feet. The leader of the trio held up a hand, halting them before they could step out of the tree line. Carefully he peered out through the mist, using his superior eyesight to scope out the path ahead for enemies or any other unwanted surprises. Finally, with a small nod, they proceeded on, swiftly vanishing from their spots in blurs of speed. When they reappeared to the civilian eye, they were stood outside of a small out-of-the-way building that looked to be barely standing. The various small, high-up windows were either broken or so clogged with dust and dirt they were practically opaque. The walls themselves were almost completely covered in vines and other parasitic plants that worked their way into every nook and cranny, weakening the concrete. Cracks mirrored the plants, winding around corners or just spreading out like black spider webs. After a moment of carefully observing the building, the leader of the group nodded again, the slight movement almost invisible in the darkened night. "Are we sure this is the place?" The leader of the group pulled back his hood, allowing his spiky blonde locks to fall about his face. He looked up at the building before them. It just had gloom written all over it, and the sooner they could be done with this mission the better. "It matches the intelligence we got." The second tallest of the group also pulled back her hood, revealing shoulder-length green tresses and half-lidded orange eyes that caught the weak moonlight. Although whether or not that makes it credible is debatable. The trio sighed at that even as the last member pulled down her hood, long purple hair flowing down her back like a waterfall. "Well, that's what we're here for, isn't it?" The leader just nodded with a grimace. This whole mission was just giving him a bad vibe, but somebody had to do it. "All right, follow my lead." With that, he leapt up onto the roof of the building, his companions following shortly afterwards. The last 3 weeks for the rebellion hadn't been all that good. Despite their victory with the prison camp, they had begun to steadily lose ground. Their supply routes were being hit harder than ever, leaving many of their off-the-grid bases in dire need of support. Only when the help finally came, they would only find a camp in ruins, the tents burned down and the rebels either missing or badly wounded. Most disturbingly, Naruto had noticed that only the supply runs that he took no part in were being ambushed these days, giving the loyalists a slight edge. It cost them both men and supplies, something the rebels really couldn't afford to lose. It spoke of a traitor amongst the rebels, somebody feeding Yagura information about their camp locations and supply movements while ensuring Naruto couldn't act against it. It was worrying because despite the investigation being done into it, no leads were being turned up. Right now, all of the forces in the north were spread thin. With their front lines weakened by lack of food and weapons, the loyalists had slipped more than a few forces into their territory. Right now, they were having to divert people away from the contested zones in order to protect their villages and towns. This in turn simply weakened their lines further, allowing more forces to slip through and continuing like this in a vicious cycle. Unless they could do something soon, or the spy was found, it didn't look too good for the rebellion. Right now, Naruto, Fo and Shizuku had been sent out to investigate a report about an old supply cache that had been supposedly abandoned around the start of the rebellion. It was in a forgotten corner of Mizu no Kuni that was neither rebel nor loyalist territory. If the reports were accurate, then the supplies here would bolster both their front lines and morale, hopefully breaking them out of this dangerous downward spiral. Usually, they would have a few more people backing them up, but they just didn't have the shinobi to spare. "All right, we go in, we split up and check everything, then meet back here, okay?" The two girls gave the monk a curt, professional nod before darting off. Before Shizuku could go too far, though, she felt a hand tighten around her wrist. When she turned back, she found herself looking into Naruto's glowing eyes. "Stay safe." He gave her a quick kiss which, when they finally parted, left the Violet with a cute blush. She gave him a quick second nod before dashing off like Fo had, leaving Naruto on his own. Taking a moment to compose himself, the blonde looked around, his keen eyes quickly spotting what he was looking for, a small ventilation shaft poking out of the roof. He knew better than to walk through the front door of a supply depot. They tended to be quite explosively trapped. While Naruto could absorb the chakra from an exploding tag, the explosion itself was a different story. He trusted in his own abilities, but time in a temple had swiftly gotten any foolishness like overestimating himself out of his system. He quickly swung his body into the shaft, muffling his feet with chakra, so that he only made the softest whisper as he touched down in the metal tube. Training in the use of silent killing might seem strange for a monk, but the name was a misnomer. it was simply the skill to move without making a sound. Killing was optional. It was all in the positioning of your feet coupled with economical movement. Unfortunately, he wasn't allowed to know the true secret of the technique, a special form of chakra manipulation that insulated the body, but it was enough. Gently he removed a panel from the ventilation shaft, silently dropping down into a small darkened room filled almost to capacity by simple wooden crates. Rolling his neck slightly from the cramped vents, he walked forward, shifting his back slightly to adjust his shikuju. During his time in the rebellion he had taken to keeping it on his back, stuck there with chakra so it was easily accessible. It made things easier on covert mission like these. Curiously he lifted the lid on one of the crates, surprised to find it stocked to the brim with kunai. When he did the same for another he found it too was completely filled by shuriken, making his eyes widen in surprise. If every box in this room was the same, then it would be enough to keep a camp going for a month, and this was only one room of the building. He hoped Fu and Shizuku were having similar luck, but before he could assess any more of the crates he heard scuffled footsteps outside the door. Acting on instinct he silently jumped up to the ceiling, sticking there like a gecko and silencing his breathing. As the door cracked open, spilling light from the corridor, he held up a single-handed ram seal, quietly whispering to himself. Boidogakure no jutsu. Like he was never there in the first place, he suddenly vanished, only the briefest ripple in the air to show he had performed the technique. Beneath him a man walked in, his kiri headband immediately showing his allegiance to the loyalists. Naruto would have known if they were receiving backup. He only seemed to briefly look into the room, his eyes darting about between the crates before leaving again. With narrowed eyes the young monk dropped from the ceiling with barely a whisper of noise. It seems we're not the only ones checking this place out. I just hope Fu and Shizuku realize that before they get noticed. Deciding to continue on anyway, Naruto quickly slipped out the door, still invisible to the senses. The corridor outside matched the rest of the building, drab and run down, cracks splintered across the walls, and the roof looked like it was on its last legs. If Naruto didn't have to be there, he probably would have left in fear of the place just falling down around him. Stealthily he moved down the corridor, checking each room as he passed. Each time he found them completely full of those same crates. He could only guess that they were as equally stocked as the others. It made him wonder why a place like this got forgotten in the first place. However, his thoughts were cut short as he was forced to once again jump to the ceiling to avoid a patrol walking beneath him. Well, not completely forgotten it seems. He was slightly annoyed by that. The intelligence they had received told them the facility was completely abandoned. No loyalists had been seen in the area for months. He didn't think that this was a coincidence. He was just about to turn back and go looking for Fu and Shizuku when another patrol walked beneath him, completely ignorant to the fact he was listening into their conversation. Here? They already found one of them. Taicho thought it would have taken more time. They're supposed to be pretty good at sneaking around. Naruto raised an eyebrow at that, slowly following the pair down the corridor as he clung to the ceiling with chakra. I know, but I was surprised when it was just a girl. She was no older than my daughter. Fucking rebels, don't they know when to draw a line? The blonde began to grow nervous as they talked. Looking up he realized he couldn't follow them much further as they were about to pass through a door. True, but what can you expect from those bloodline freaks? They don't think like us real people. I'm just glad Yugura-sama. Naruto missed the rest as the door closed behind them. He had a frown firmly plastered on his face as he dropped to the floor. He really did not like the sound of that. Carefully he slunk back through the corridors, searching for any signs of his wayward teammates as he dodged more patrols. He wasn't worried about Fu. When the mint-haired girl wanted to be, she could completely blend in with her environment, like a camouflaged insect. No, it was Shizuku who Naruto couldn't help but worry over. While the girl had made leaps and bounds in her taijutsu and ninjutsu, stealth was still a relatively new concept to her. She had good senses though and knew when to stay out of trouble, but the problem was if she was already in trouble before she realized it. They had only recently started her in enhancing her eyes and ears with chakra. He just hoped that small lesson was enough. As he passed through another door, the faintest of clicks graced his chakra-heightened ears. Time almost seemed to slow to a crawl as he looked down and spotted the trailing end of the near-invisible wire he had just broken with the door. His muscles were already contracting to leap away as he brought his hand up, the chakra surging through his coils as he watched the small tag fall from the ceiling, one side already half engulfed in flame. The explosion, in such a confined space like the supply building, was deafening. His ears were ringing with various phantom pitches as he staggered back. His control slipped and his semi-translucent body suddenly became visible, blurry and indefinite, but definitely noticeable. It was only by pure instinct that he managed to dive into a nearby room, one wall completely caved in by the blast, as a few shinobi suddenly rushed by. He lay there for a moment, his eyes wide and his breathing ragged as he waited for the perpetual ringing to stop. When it finally decreased to a dull monotonous whine, he could quite clearly hear the dull thumps of sandal-clad feet rushing by while he was safe for now surrounded by boxes. Dredging up what sense he could, the blonde shook his head, clearing out the last of the concussive blast's effects on his ears. He had been lucky to pull out a Shinra Tensei in time. The tag only had 2 seconds between being tripped and detonating. As he jumped up to the ceiling, he re-engaged his technique, rallying his control over his erratic chakra, still pulsating wildly after such a shock. It was just in time as not a moment later 2 shinobi raced into the room, carelessly knocking aside half-destroyed crates and sending kunai and shuriken skittering across the debris-ridden floor. It was only after a few anxious minutes of them poking at various crates did they finally leave, allowing Naruto to drop down to the ground again. Rolling his neck slightly, he quickly dashed from the room. His control over the Boidogakure technique had grown to the point where he could move at a decent jog without losing focus. However, it unfortunately dampened his reaction times, what with his concentration being split 2 or more ways at once. He found that out the hard way when another shinobi emerged from a door just to Naruto's left, leaving the two to crash into one another, much to the Kirinin's surprise. Hey what Naruto had already pressed his shikuju to the man's forehead before he could utter another syllable, but the damage was done. His trained ear picked up the sound of sandals suddenly turning on dust-covered floors, approaching him with a lot of haste. He raced from the room again, doing his best to control his erratic chakra, but only partially succeeding. He hadn't realized how far he had managed to lose himself in the twisting hallways of the building until he found himself trying to escape, dodging shinobi like some kind of strange obstacle course. He was half a breath away from simply turning around and blasting everybody back when he finally found himself in a somewhat more open area that didn't seem to fit the scale of the building he had seen from outside. When he thought back though, he realized he had gone down a flight of stairs at some point, barely even registering it as he vaulted a young man with pale blue hair. He stood there a moment, glancing around the room quickly to find the nearest escape route. If you were looking for the exit, it was behind you. A loud clank sounded behind Naruto as the door he had just come through suddenly bolted shut from the other side. However, the blonde ignored that, instead looking towards the silhouette that had just separated itself from the shadows on the other side of the room. How interesting, I was sure it would be the other one I caught first. What was her name? Slowly Naruto pulled his shikuju off of his back. He was still invisible, but that didn't seem to stop the man from looking straight at him. Oh, please boy, you can drop the jutsu, I know exactly where you are. I know where everything is within a mile of myself. Naruto stared still for a moment, barely even breathing before slowly shimmering into existence. The man wasn't bluffing, he could see his light pink eyes following the movement of his arm as he removed his shikuju perfectly, despite not being visible. He calmly walked further into the room, into a large area, at the center illuminated by a large flood lamp overhead. I suppose you might be wondering how I knew where you were, or why you couldn't detect me before, or perhaps who I am, NE. Naruto just kept his face impassive, his eyes narrowed slightly further than usual. I know who you are, Yagura. The man just chuckled softly as he too stepped into the light, an amused smile gracing his lips that didn't quite reach his cold, almost dead eyes. Ah, you took out half the fun. I had an entire monologue written out, but you had to go and ruin it. He laughed quietly to himself again as he moved further forward, his steps uncaring and almost jovial. I was always one for the theatrical, but I suppose you might have heard stories from your leader, Annie? Naruto stayed silent, bringing a greatly exaggerated pout to the young-looking man's face. Now don't be like that, I was expecting some rather pleasant conversation. It's not often I get to talk with a monk. They have a tendency to leave my country for some reason or another. As he spoke, a decidedly cruel glint entered his eyes for just a fleeting moment, but long enough for Naruto to catch it. Should I answer the questions that are so obviously tugging at your mind right now? Then again, I do love the look on somebody's face as they struggle for answers right up until the moment they realize it's all pointless anyway. Again, Naruto stayed silent, calmly eyeing the man in his relaxed posture, so completely uncaring of the situation. So quiet, home? That's not at all like the reports I've been getting. He looked up for a moment, a distant look in his eyes as if he was remembering a fond memory. Friendly, peaceful, always the last to advocate conflict yet the first to finish it, Annie? I had pictured you differently. He smirked slightly as he looked at Naruto up and down in a way that made the blonde feel like a piece of meat on display. Taller for one. Naruto kept his face blank, his eyes subtly moving around the room as he searched for any escape routes. He had heard about Yagura, many different stories, many different perspectives, all painting the same image. He rarely came out from Kirigakure, preferring to lead his troops from afar with a calculating mind, like pieces on a chessboard. However, when he did emerge, he was like a completely different person. He would wade through battlefields, slaughtering anybody who crossed his path like they were nothing but nuisances. The only time people had ever seen him become even remotely serious was a brief scuffle where May first faced off against him. People didn't tell him much about that fight, most didn't care to remember. Not even going to rise to that? How very disappointing. I've always hated one-sided conversations, it makes me feel like some two-bit monologuing villain, Annie? Naruto remained quiet, slowly twitching his hand up in hopes of catching the Mizukage off guard. Like he had told himself many times, he was confident in his own abilities, but he was by no means cocky. Taking on the Mizukage, or any Kage, sounded out of his reach. Oh, I wouldn't do that if I were you. Naruto's hand hesitated for a moment as a smirk twitched on Yagura's lips. Something bad might happen if you were to unleash one of your invisible blasts in such a tight space, Annie? With a simple hand motion from the diminutive Kage, 10 shinobi suddenly dropped from the darkness of the ceiling, making Naruto's eyes widen in surprise at not seeing them before. Seeing this, Yagura's smirk turned into a full-blown grin, his eyes lighting up in almost sadistic pleasure. Ah, there it is. The confusion, the shock, the questions. He chuckled to himself again, taking on a barely sane expression. So many questions, Annie? His face became serious again, or at least his eyes did. He still managed to keep that confident and irritating smirk firmly plastered on his scarred face. Did you really think you were the only one with the ability to go unnoticed? The only one to be able to turn invisible? You probably counted on the fact I wouldn't be able to detect you, Annie? His chuckle came out lower that time, more menacing. Please boy, ever since the second Tsuchikage, people all over the nation scrambled to come up with techniques to rival his own, not to mention ways of countering it. It's almost a shame my predecessor died killing him. I would have loved to known how he managed it. Either way, I came up with my own way. What with Jiraiya of the Sannin so famous for his stealth, it wouldn't do for Konoha or anybody else interfering in my country. His voice was gleeful again. He obviously loved the sound of his own voice a little too much. Water's such an incredible thing, Annie? It's all around us, hanging in the air, in the ground, in the sky, and in our bodies. Did you know that around 6% of the air you're breathing, walking through, standing in, is water vapor? By pushing my chakra through these trace amounts of water, I can literally sense everything within a mile radius. Plants, people, rocks, it doesn't matter as long as they have physical form. Yagura grinned maliciously as his eyes returned to staring at Naruto. But I seem to be getting away from myself, Annie? Ah, that's right, I was just about to send a message to Toromi and her fleeting little rebellion. What better way to do that than to string up their little helper? Don't think I don't know that you're the one who irritated my forces over the last few months, you and those two little girls that follow you around like puppies. The manic gleam returned to the man's eyes as he saw Naruto narrow his eyes. Surprised, Eni? You really shouldn't be. I'm the Mizukage or Kirigakure no Sato, I am Mizu no Kuni, there is nothing I cannot see within the shores of my land. Naruto tried to catch the man off guard, quickly bringing his hand up in hopes of bringing down the roof on top of them. However, he faltered as Yugura made a single subtle gesture with his finger and two more Kiri Anbu dropped from the ceiling. He hesitated because carried between them was Shizuku, her head hung forward and her body limp. Shizuku. Yugura grinned at finally getting a reaction out of the blonde, motioning for the two Anbu to bring the girl over to him. The boy finally speaks. I was beginning to think you were too frightened to talk, and that would have just been too boring, Eni? Naruto was doing his best to control himself, but seeing Shizuka's limp, almost lifeless body like that had his fist trembling. The only thing that held him back was the fact he could still see her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Interesting company you keep, Eni? I thought for sure we had wiped out the Huzuki clan with Mangetsu. Yet along comes little Shizuku here with her prodigious affinity for water ninjutsu and ability to perform what should have been a technique to die out with that traitorous swordsman. The young-looking man had grown slightly angry and his rant bit quickly calmed himself down, putting a finger to his brow in amusement again. You want to know something interesting about the unique physiology of the Huzuki clan? Yugura idly looked at his hand, turning it back and forth as brief sparks of lighting began to dance between his fingers. While they are immune to almost any physical attack, be it blunt force trauma, or even blades, they have an unusually low pain tolerance when it comes to electricity. I say unusual as during their technique they don't physically have nerves, yet even so. Without warning the man suddenly grabbed Shizuka by the back of the neck, channeling the lightning into her body with a manic, gleeful smile. They still feel the pain. Shizuku's head suddenly shot up, her eyes wide as she screamed in agony. Shizuku. Naruto was about to rush forward when Yugura suddenly stopped, letting Shizuka slump back to the floor, her body convulsing as blue sparks faded away over her body. Ah, what did I tell you about doing something brash? Somebody could get hurt, Eni? Naruto stopped, his hands now both clenched into fists that trembled at his sides. His head was lowered slightly so that his messy hair fell about his forehead, shadowing his eyes. Let her go. The Mizukage raised an eyebrow in amusement as he passed his staff from one hand to the other in a way eerily reminiscent of the way Naruto would with his shikuju. What was that? I could have sworn I just heard a monk demanding something from a kage. He smirked cruelly as he reached down, picking Shizuku up, but the back of her neck. The girl was in too much pain to even struggle, she was just held there limply in the man's surprisingly strong grip. She couldn't even focus long enough to use the hydrification technique, her body was just too unresponsive. She screamed out again as another wave of electricity passed through her body, although this time when it stopped Yugura kept a hold of her. Let her go. Naruto took a step forward, making many of the Anbu in the room twitch their hands towards their kunai pouches. Again, Yugura only seemed amused, thoughtful even, before he quickly tossed the girl towards one of his men. The Anbu grabbed her and held her roughly, a kunai pressed against her chest as a warning. The message was clear, if Naruto tried anything the man would not hesitate to kill Shizuku. Oh, so I did hear you right, how odd, Eni. He looked up, tapping his chin for a moment as he continued to smile down at the trembling monk. You know what, I'm anything if not a merciful man. How about a demonstration of just how outclassed you are here, how outclassed this pathetic little rebellion is? I'll even let you leave here if you win. As he spoke, a large grin spread over his features as he lifted his arms wide, almost mockingly. Naruto needed no further invitation as his hand shot up, the Mizukage's eyes already following the action and moving accordingly. Shinra Tensei. Adrenaline pumped through the blonde's body, slowing everything around him slightly. He had put enough force behind that attack to level a small building, certainly enough to incapacitate a man if it hit them directly. However, Yagura wasn't idle, his staff had already flashed forward, inscribing a wide circle in the air faster than most could blink. Suiton, Mizukagami no Jutsu. The young-looking Kage's tone was almost lazy as he stood there, watching like everybody else as water suddenly congregated in that spot, forming into a perfectly flat, circular mirror. What happened next would have made most believe Naruto had done nothing at all, but with his eyes Naruto could see everything. A perfect replica of his technique emerged from the mirror, clashing with his own Shinra Tensei and cancelling it out completely. There wasn't even a breeze to show two insanely powerful jutsu had collided, it was simply nullified in its entirety. Now do you see, monk? Your every attack, your every move, copied down to the last detail and sent right back at you. It's useless, NE? Naruto just grimaced as he put both hands up, channeling an enormous amount of chakra into his hands and focusing it to the best of his ability. Shinra Tensei. This time there was no mistaking that Naruto had done something. In an instant a deep gorge was gouged from the earth, shredding through the concrete as powerful gravitational waves rent the earth. When the resulting smoke finally cleared, Naruto was shocked to see an identical trench meeting his, emerging from the mirror which was completely unscathed. The Mizukage appeared around the side, a playful smirk on his face as he twirled his staff absently. See it now, monk? I don't know how I could make it any clearer with a mirror right in front of you. Naruto just huffed once before crouching, his muscles tensing before he suddenly shot forward, actually surprising many of the ANBU that a boy as young as him could move so fast. Meanwhile the Mizukage yawned into his hand, harmlessly dispersing his technique as he twirled his staff. Naruto was inches away from striking the man with two pointed fingers crackling with electricity when his eyes widened in surprise. It happened so fast many would have missed it even if they didn't blink. One moment Yagura was lazily leaning against his staff, the next he had it held out in front of him. Naruto sailed back, skidding across the ground for a moment before rolling to a stop and coughing violently. Tentatively he got to his feet, clutching his chest where he was sure a large bruise would be forming. He hadn't even seen Yagura move yet he had struck him almost effortlessly. The worst part was Naruto somehow knew he was holding back on that blow. Ah, is that all? You know I was hoping for a lot more from you. He looked around whimsically, once again twirling his staff, as if he hadn't a care in the world. Then again, I guess there's no sand in here for you to use, NE? He smirked as Naruto's hands clenched again, but frowned as a grim smile made its way onto the blonde's face. Wrong. Suddenly the backs of his hands glowed as two seals suddenly revealed themselves. Moments later copious amounts of sand suddenly poured out, surrounding Naruto protectively. It wasn't as much as he would like, but he had to make do with what little he could seal. It was difficult to seal chakra-imbued substances, especially something like his sand. Yagura actually raised an eyebrow for a moment before chuckling to himself. Now that's a little more like it, but unfortunately for you, not enough. He suddenly crouched down, placing two fingers on the floor with a smirk. Sangishu. Before Naruto could react, the ground around Yagura suddenly changed. Random growths of strange red material suddenly appeared, spreading out at an alarming rate. As it approached, Naruto suddenly recognized it as coral, except it was growing as if it were alive. In mere moments he was surrounded by it. He sent out his sand to destroy it, but to his horror, as soon as a single grain touched the coral it was simply engulfed by it. It spread so fast that sand didn't stand a chance. Soon it was all gone, either surrounded by or simply absorbed into the red substance. Naruto quickly jumped up and away from it before it could reach him and ensnare him too, landing in a clear spot. When he turned, Yagura raised his hand off the ground and the coral simply crumbled away, as if it had never been there, taking the sand with it. His attention was brought back to the Mizukage as he tapped his staff on the ground once. Well, now I'm bored. It was amusing for a moment, but ultimately it served its purpose. Do you now see what you face? Do you now see why it is futile to struggle against me? He smirked, absently tapping his chin with the end of his staff. I had wanted to send a message to the rebellion, and had you been the one to send it, but honestly you're a little too dangerous to keep alive, any?" The man sighed theatrically, but his cruel eyes showed no regrets. "Oh well, I'll find another way. My men are closing in on your little green-haired friend on the other end of the building. Maybe she could do it in your stead." He looked up, staring into the distance in a contemplative manner before shrugging carelessly. "In any case, you two are now unnecessary." With a simple gesture from the man's hand, Naruto was forced to watch in horror as the ANBU holding Shizuku suddenly brought his kunai back. It was in horrific slow motion that he watched the kunai pierce his friend's flesh, blood spurting through the air as Shizuku's head came up. Tears stained her cheeks as her eyes whitened in pain and surprise, her mouth open in a silent scream. She winced as the kunai was ripped out again, now stained a vibrant red as tiny rivulets of blood slid down its length. Shizuku and Naruto just stared at the patch of red that quickly spread behind her clothes. Her eyes came up and met with his for a single second before time crashed back down on them. Chapter 32, Water 8. Drip. Drip. Naruto's eyes focused intently as another small drop of crimson splashed out on the floor, creating a small circular stain. It was joined by another, then another, before a veritable deluge of red liquid fell from Shizuku's wound. He ignored everything else, his breathing, the sound of the ANBU wiping off the bloodied kunai, even the sound Yagura made as he passed his staff from one hand to the other. His focus was entirely on Shizuku, and the slowly growing patch of scarlet around the tear in her kimono top. "You see, monk, everybody in the world has a weakness as long as they make foolish attachments to others. As a Kage you come to understand that to best rule your people, your forces, you must discard these petty feelings. I believe that is what you monks are taught, is it not? To discard feeling and look objectively at the world in order to attain enlightenment, any?" Yagura gazed at the stunned blonde coolly, raising a disinterested eyebrow at his lack of response. The pale-haired man simply sighed as he turned, shrugging rather nonchalantly as he made a deft motion with his hand. Shizuku's body was thrown forward unceremoniously, rolling across the ground and leaving a small trail of her blood in random patches where she bounced, each time letting out another pained cry. Naruto was almost immediately at her side. None of the ANBU moved, awaiting orders from Yagura, but a few hands still twitched towards their respective weapon pouches. Naruto gently rolled Shizuku over, grimacing when the girl shuddered in pain and coughed up blood, staining her normally pale chin an ugly red. I am sorry, Naruto." The blonde's hand trembled when he heard her weak voice, staring uselessly at the gaping hole in her chest that was still pouring out copious amounts of blood. "Don't talk, I can still help, I can get you somewhere to help." The girl's body was racked with shudders again as her head tilted up in another painful cough, blood flecking her now dirted clothes. "And Naruto?" The blonde grabbed one of her hands in his own, squeezing it in what he hoped was a comforting manner. "Please don't talk, you need to save your energy, right? That's what you're supposed to do in these situations, right?" The blonde couldn't help but notice his voice now had a faintly hysterical edge as one trembling hand moved over Shizuku's body, trying to do something to stop the bleeding. When he pressed on the wound though, Shizuku's eyes closed in agonizing pain. It did nothing anyway, too much blood leaked between his fingers. "And Naruto, please." The boy just grabbed her hand again, helpless eyes darting around madly looking, searching for something, anything he could do to stop this. He didn't know medical ninjutsu, first aid would do nothing for something this severe. He felt so utterly and completely useless as he watched the girl he cared about so much bleed out right before his eyes. "Come on, Shizuku, stop with that voice, all right?" A weak smile made its way onto Naruto's face as he held the girl's hand a little higher, squeezing it gently with that same hysterical tone in his voice. "You're acting like you're going to die or something." He chuckled shakily as Shizuku's eyelids began to slowly droop, fluttering back up with every jolt of pain coursing through her veins. Slowly she felt her body become numb, the pain ebbing away in favor of a strange detachment, as if her body was no longer hers, and she was just a spectator. "Naruto." His lips quivered slightly as she struggled with the words, already feeling the edges of her vision grow dark. All she could see were the two quivering orbs of Naruto's rippled eyes looking down at her with almost frantic worry, a few strands of blonde hair falling across them. He seemed to perk up slightly with her voice, giving a hand another pointless but comforting squeeze. Unfortunately, she could no longer feel the limp hand held in his grasp. Please stop crying." Her voice choked up at the end as more specks of red found their way onto her otherwise pale lips. Naruto just blinked, noticing for the first time the few drops of clear liquid on Shizuku's cheeks, one of them lazily rolling down the curvature of her face. He lifted a still shaking hand up to his eyes and wiped at them, staring down with what appeared to be shock at the warm tears on the end of his finger. His eyes widened when Shizuku raised a shaking, but still controlled hand up to his cheek, rubbing his whisker marks once before wiping them of the stains his tears had made. A faint, fleeting smile twitched at the corners of her mouth as a brief spark re-entered her eyes in that moment. There, that's better." It didn't last for long as her body was once again racked with painful coughs that had her head swimming from the pain. The darkness around her vision grew, and she began to lose sight of Naruto's face as the image grew fuzzy. With her last ounce of strength, Shizuku forced another brief smile onto her face as her eyes closed. They just felt too heavy to keep open, and right now she was so very tired. "Naruto, thank you." And with that, Shizuku's shallow breathing stopped entirely, her fluttering heartbeat coming to a slow, peaceful stop as her head fell to one side. Naruto became pale as he knelt there, hands covered in his friend's blood grasping at her cooling shoulders. Shizuku?" He felt his breath begin to quicken as Shizuku didn't answer. Her body stayed limp, unmoving, lifeless. "Shizuku?" His grip on her shoulders tightened slightly as he gently shook her, as if she was only asleep and she simply needed to wake up. "Shizuku?" He felt warm tears prickling at the edges of his vision again, but sniffed them back. She didn't want him to cry, so he wouldn't. "Come on, Shizuku, you have to wake up. We still have things to do, don't we?" A pained smile was forced across his lips as he continued to lightly shake the girl by her shoulders. "Come on, we were going to try and find your family, remember?" He choked up a little as he literally felt the girl's warmth leak out in his hands. We still had stuff to do, right, like your techniques?" His heart rate rose quickly as his smile turned into a pained frown. He lifted Shizuku's body up and hugged her against him, uncaring of the blood now staining his robes. His hands were covered in it anyway. "We were going to go to Suna and make it rain." His voice was little more than a hoarse whisper at this point, tears freely flowing down his cheeks as he just held the girl there. He wasn't sure how long he stayed there with her cold body pressed up against his, her limp head resting on his shoulder as he sobbed. It was probably only a few seconds, but it felt like a lot longer. Gently and slowly, he lowered her body back down to the floor, wiping off the last of his tears and leaving red smudges across his cheeks carelessly. With shaking legs, he stood up, his eyes still firmly locked on his friend's still, unmoving body. Yagura listened to all of this with a decidedly bored expression, absently staring at one of his fingers. He had granted the boy the girl's dying words on a whim to see if anything interesting happened, and he was rather disappointed. Usually, it excited him to see the light leaving his victim's eyes, but this time he just felt indifferent. He felt as though he had dragged this out a little too long and wanted to get back to his nice cozy office. Absently, he made another gesture with the hand he wasn't looking at. "Deal with him, I've lost interest in this." He didn't bother turning back to look when all of his ANBU drew out as many kunai as they could. He heard the faint whistle as the wall of steel flew forward through the air, none of them even remotely off course. He only had the best in ANBU after all. He also noted with some amusement that even the ANBU he still had stationed in the shadows of the ceiling heeded his signal, adding to the barrage of flying weapons bearing down on the young monk. However, his ears twitched slightly when they weren't rewarded with the satisfying sound of metal hitting flesh. Instead, all he got was the idle clatter of kunai hitting the floor, as if a ninja had simply upturned his pouch and emptied it onto the ground. When he turned, he saw Naruto still standing there, not a mark marring his body. His hand was raised up, palm flat towards them, while his hair fell forward shadowing his eyes. Around him, like a ring of steel, was a small armory of kunai, not a single one anywhere closer than 2 meters to his body. Still fighting, even now? I thought you had realized the futility of such pointless actions, NE? Naruto didn't say anything, his head remained down and his gaze on Shizuka's lifeless body. Slowly his hand lowered, coming to a stop at his side in a tightly clenched fist. Blood dripped from between his fingers and Yagura couldn't tell if it was from the girl or his own from his fingernails biting into his palm. The Mizukage just sighed lazily, leaning against his staff without a care, as he tapped his chin thoughtfully, wondering how to make this more interesting. He didn't have to though, as he and the ANBU watched on a malevolent aura began to spread through the room. The winds around Naruto seemed to pick up slightly even as his body remained perfectly still, making his robes flutter slightly. Yagura was unimpressed, the level of killing intent was barely even noticeable to him, and the ANBU weren't much worse off. However, it quickly began to pick up, the winds that only seemed to affect the young monk grew in their intensity, making his hair fly about, still somehow managing to shadow his eyes through it all. Gradually the malicious aura permeating the air began to weigh down on the men in the room like an invisible pressure. Soon they realized it wasn't just that, there really was an actual pressure weighing down on their shoulders, making their bodies feel heavy and sluggish. Yagura still seemed unaffected, but he at least had noticed the added weight on his body. Only a few of them noticed as Naruto's hands clenched even harder, and with every muscle contraction the pressure on them increased. It was only a few seconds before the first of them cracked, an ANBU on the ceiling that was struggling for breath dropping to the ground. Others soon followed, dropping down to their knees as they could barely stand to hold up their own weight, suddenly feeling as though they had enormous iron chains pulling down on their bodies. Through it all Yagura stayed standing, the only noticeable change being his eyes narrowing slightly, and his teeth gritting in mild annoyance. The winds around Naruto were now so strong that a faint cloud of dust had begun to circle him steadily, his hair lifted up into the air that had begun to shimmer around him. Yagura recognized what was happening, and he could honestly say he was surprised. He had seen this many times before, but usually because he was at the center of it all. Vile red chakra began leaking from Naruto's skin, so concentrated it was actually visible, and started to form a shroud. It bubbled menacingly, as if it was alive and just waiting to lash out at anything and everything that came near. Ever so slightly Naruto hunched over as the raw, potent chakra continued to stream out of his body. A Jinchuriki? Those pesky rebels are better at hiding their secrets than I give them credit for, NE? Yagura lazily rolled his shoulders, spinning his staff once only to slam it down in front of him. I hope you know that won't save you, a brat like you could never have mastered your forms. The young-looking Mizukage gave a vicious grin that went unnoticed by the blonde at the other end of the room. I on the other hand have no such restrictions, NE? Upon not receiving an answer the Kage's lips twitched slightly, he hated to be ignored, especially by somebody beneath him. It's very rude to ignore your superiors, NE? The only response he got was the cloak bubbling more as 3 thick and swaying tails of chakra emerged from the base of Naruto's spine. At the same time the cloak around his feet widened into a shape more reminiscent of paws, while on his head 2 long ears of chakra sprouted from the shroud. Yagura just smirked, the bubbles in the cloak showed the boy had no control whatsoever, just a slave to the biju's emotions, in this case most likely rage. The strange thing was that wasn't the only thing happening. What the Mizukage had first believed to be dust billowing around the boy's feet actually revealed itself to be sand as it grew thicker around him. It would twitch upwards at random but never strayed more than 2 meters from the blonde, just circling him almost protectively. Not only that, the area of the cloak surrounding his arms was different, taking on a more purplish hue, and appeared to be flaming more than bubbling like the rest. Then, all of a sudden, it stopped. Naruto's eyes snapped open, and in that moment the tails and various other parts of the shroud that made him appear fox-like vanished. However, the cloak disturbingly remained, no longer undefined and bubbling, now crisp and sharp around his body like a second skin of chakra. Slowly and deliberately the monk's head turned, allowing his deep purple eyes to lock with Yagura's more confused pink ones. You! His voice was almost a whisper, barely audible, yet there was no mistaking that it was his own. There was no hint of any other influence guiding him as he took a step forward. Yagura just blinked in surprise. What he was seeing should be impossible. Manifesting a full cloak without the tails, and no physical change to his body was unheard of. It was like the chakra wasn't a Biju's, but his to control as he saw fit. As his foot hit the ground, it created a small crater from the sheer pressure of the energy surrounding Naruto. Yagura snarled lightly. He hated being misinformed and caught off guard like this. It showed weakness, and he was anything but weak. In an instant he was surrounded by a similar aura of dark red chakra, 3 long tails like those belonging to a shrimp waving almost excitedly behind him. Even his staff was encased by the energy, making the flower wither slightly under the corrosive shroud. Unlike Naruto, his body changed slightly. His eyes became red and ringed with a single golden band around the pupil. "You're punching above your weight class, boy." The aura in the air became even more oppressive, with the second Jinchuriki releasing his inner chakra. However, where Yagura's was controlled but filled with an innate rage, Naruto's simply felt cold and powerful. The blonde never stopped walking forward, with each step creating another small crater as the ground beneath him splintered. As he got closer, the pressure pushing down on the ANBU increased. All of them were pressed flat to the floor by now. Many of them began to whimper in pain despite their training, feeling their rib cages be slowly crushed as if some enormous weight had been placed on their chests. "You should stop now, boy, before I force you, Ni." Naruto's features nearly twisted into an almost animalistic snarl, however his eyes never strayed from Yagura's. The Kage would never admit it, but he was incredibly unnerved by those eyes, so full of cold, unbridled fury, glowing with the chakra coursing through the young blonde's body. Yagura just let out a deep growl from somewhere in the back of his throat and charged forward, blasting a few tiles back from the speed he moved. There was an explosion of dust and debris as the two met, Yagura with his staff raised to strike and Naruto doing nothing. It took a few moments for the air to clear, but when it did, the few ANBU that could successfully lift their heads or were lucky enough to be looking in the right direction could only widen their eyes behind their masks. Naruto simply stood there in a large crater, the sand still whipping around him angrily. Yagura was about a foot of the ground, held up with Naruto's hand firmly around his throat. The staff lay on the ground, knocked from his hands faster than the Kage could comprehend before he was seized painfully. Even through the protective cloak of the Sanbai's chakra, he could feel that slightly flaming purple hand around his throat, tightening slowly. When he looked down, he saw Naruto hadn't changed. His face was still twisted into a snarl, and his eyes were just as cold. However, there was something there now, a glint of a feeling Yagura hadn't ever seen when fighting somebody before: satisfaction. Faster than an eye could even blink, Naruto pulled back his arm that held the shocked Kage in its grasp and launched the man forward. The Biju-cloaked Mizukage flew backwards, propelled by incredible force through the ceiling of the room, out through the ground above him. Naruto cast a cold, impassive look around the room, his eyes lingering on Shizuku's body for a split second as his gaze softened before it re-hardened at the ANBU. He walked back to Shizuku's body, picking it up under one arm, not even stopping to marvel at how impossibly light she felt. He looked up, pointing his closed fist to the hole Yagura's body had sailed through before splaying his hand. Instantly the roof of the room was blown back. Naruto didn't even have to speak. His chakra simply molded instinctively, sending gravitational forces rippling through the room with more power than he had ever used before. He jumped up with a powerful burst of chakra, hovering for a moment over the ground before touching the wet grass above. Around him the ground fell apart, crushing everything in the room. A part of him realized those ANBU were still down there, another part just didn't care. With gentleness that most wouldn't think possible with him enshrouded in such foul and potent chakra, Naruto lay Shizuku down on the ground. He soon turned his attention back to the Mizukage, who just then emerged from the tree line, looking rightfully irritated. Naruto on the other hand gazed with a cool rage burning just beneath his purple orbs, directed entirely at the gray-haired man. "I'll admit you surprised me with that, boy. I had not expected you to be so fast. Do not think I will underestimate you again." Naruto remained where he was, eyes remaining locked on Yagura, as a cool rain poured from the sky, evaporating instantly when it met the two Jinchuriki's cloaks. The young-looking Kage suddenly hunched over as the oppressive and overwhelming chakra around his body suddenly contracted. The skin on his body began to peel away in a grotesque manner, giving way to a black and red seething mass of pure unrestrained chakra. Soon all that remained was a small, humanoid figure with three shrimp-like tails, and a spiky tortoise-esque shell made of the same almost liquid chakra. Naruto didn't even blink, he just slowly walked forward, his feet still creating craters with each step. The miniature Sanbai suddenly raised its head back, tails coming forward and hovering over the mouth of the beast. Little orbs of blue and red chakra burst out of its body all over, floating for a moment before suddenly rushing back in, compressing into a large black ball. The chakra beast wavered for a moment, the tail struggling under the weight of the compressed chakra that looked like it was trying to burst outwards despite its perfectly spherical shape. Undeterred, Naruto stalked forward, not even making a motion to defend himself as the mini Sanbai finally gained control over its attack, suddenly launching the Bijudama forward. Naruto's lips merely twitched as the enormously dangerous attack rocketed forward. He stopped, taking a deep breath, while all the while maintaining eye contact with the red humanoid mass that was Yagura. Before the Bijudama could hit, four long projections of chakra suddenly emerged from Naruto's cloak, acting similarly to when Yagura had created the sphere and catching it with their tips. A huge shockwave blasted back the nearby trees as the figurative immovable object and unstoppable force met before a moment of stillness settled over the clearing. Almost immediate, the large black sphere shrank, not compressing, but simply dwindling away as Naruto completely absorbed the powerful attack. As soon as it was gone, the long tail-like projections shrank back into the cloak, and Naruto resumed walking forward. The version to Yagura's large white eyes widened in surprise and, unwittingly, fear as the chakra-cloaked monk moved towards him. Banzhou Tenin. Before Yagura could do anything, he was flying through the air towards the blonde outstretched hand. Once again, the normally unstoppable Kage found his neck tightly in Naruto's grip as his hand slowly began to squeeze. Much to the Jinchuriki's horror, where his cloak met Naruto's hand, it began to bleed away, revealing his own skin beneath. He could literally feel both his own and the Sanbai's chakra get absorbed into the younger boy, something that by all accounts should have killed him due to the Bijou chakra's corrosive and poisonous properties. Suddenly all three of his briny tails jabbed forward, indenting to skewer the boy that dare hold him, Akage, in such a manner. However, they were immediately halted by the sand still circling his feet, acting as if by its own volition. For the very first time since Yagura had become the Yandere Mizukage, as he was held there by a boy less than a third his age, he felt true, unrequited fear in his heart. Suddenly a snarl appeared on his strange red face as his struggles renewed with vigor. "It's not over yet, monk." An explosion rocked through the clearing that even managed to blast Naruto back, leaving him to skid along the ground, leaving two long trenches where his feet ripped through the earth. When he lowered his arms from shielding his eyes, he stared up with that same fury at the enormous visage of the mighty Sanbai no Kaiodame itself, which only stared back with one furious eye. It released an almighty encompassing roar that could be heard for miles around that Naruto didn't even flinch at. Slowly, languidly even, the chakra-shrouded blonde began to raise himself up into the air, until he was above even the mighty Bijou. He stared down at the beast with cold, fury-filled eyes that had the beast's own widen in shock before he raised a single arm. Shinra Tensei. Fo hadn't finished dealing with the Kirigakure shinobi, that had suddenly appeared out of nowhere when the earth-shaking blast rocked the building. All around them the cracks in the walls grew as dust rained from the ceiling. Everybody had the same thought of self-preservation as they rushed from the building, finding the nearest exit and dashing out into the rainy night. As they did, a deafening roar echoed out that filled all of the shinobi with an innate, terrifying feeling as they looked towards the source with horror. Fo didn't waste time like that. She knew that wherever that roar came from, Naruto was bound to be close by. She jumped up onto the top of the building and dashed across even as the roof began to collapse around her. She had to stop a moment as a massive shockwave of air and dust suddenly blasted past her, forcing her to grip the roof with chakra before carrying on when it finally cleared. She leapt off at the other end, sprinting at full speed towards where she could feel the oppressive power of an unleashed Jinchuriki up ahead. Fu didn't know if that meant Naruto was fighting a Jinchuriki, or he had resorted to his own Bijuu's power. Either way it was bad and Fu knew she had to do something to help. After all, there were few better to suppress a Jinchuriki than with another Jinchuriki. Finally, she emerged into a large clearing that looked recently made. The trees around the edge were all violently bent back, most were broken and shattered into splinters. In the epicenter of the massive clearing was an equally large crater, and at the center of that was an unbelievable sight. Naruto was holding a humanoid creature Fu knew to be a version 2 Jinchuriki forms, and based on the tales she knew it had to be the Sanbai container, Yagura. She sighed in relief when she saw Naruto didn't even look remotely injured, a strange tailless cloak surrounding him as his eyes bored into Yagura's. As she continued to watch, the red layer bled away, absorbed into Naruto's body through the contact he had around the Mizuki's neck. At that moment something else caught her eye, as the edge of the enormous crater was a limp, lifeless body that had Fu's eyes widening in surprise and shock. Yagura began to feel his vision go fuzzy as the blonde monk holding him up by his throat continued to steal all of his chakra, both his and the Sanbai's. He could only look into the boy's purple rippled eyes, chuckling to himself inside as he thought about the irony of being killed by a bloodline user, one with the most powerful Dojutsu ever known no less. He was surprised though when, as he felt the last of his tenant's chakra be absorbed, he saw something change in the monk's eyes. For a brief instant, almost unnoticeable if he hadn't been looking directly at them, 3 tomo appeared in the boy's eyes. 2 circled the outermost ring in the eye, forming 2/3 of a triangle between them, while the last was on its own in the center ring, the small tail of the Magatama flicking away from the pupil. As he watched, a 4th tomo materialized in the outermost ring, completing the triangle before all 4 faded away. A choking laugh escaped his throat that only served to have the blonde tighten his grip even further, cutting him off. "What now, monk, will you kill me? But that's breaking your moral code, Annie." He managed a grim smile as Naruto continued to glare at him with those murderous, legendary eyes that narrowed. "You deserve worse than death for everything you've done." The young-looking Kage coughed, already feeling his life slipping away from the forced removal of his bijou. No matter what happened, he was going to die. Strangely, he felt no fear, only a strange, almost uplifting freedom. It would have sent him into a fit of hysterical laughter if his windpipe wasn't currently being crushed in the boy's hand. "Maybe, maybe not, but are you going to be my executioner? You don't have it in you. We both know it." Naruto looked away at that and Yagura felt the boy's hand tremble slightly. He managed one last grin at his supposed last victory that quickly died on his face as the blonde's gaze snapped back round. Human path. Time froze for Yagura as a cold chill swept through his body, like a million tiny hooks were grabbing at every fiber of his body. It burned like he had been buried in ice, then, just as suddenly, it stopped with a horrific ripping sound. There was a moment of peace as he felt free, like a stray cloud floating on the breeze, then, nothing. That was for Shizuku. Naruto panted slightly as the cloak of chakra around his body slowly dissipated. He still held Yagura's body in one hand, now limp. He dropped it to the floor coldly just as he felt another presence at his side. Fu looked down at the dead body of the Yandere Mizuki with a mixture of contempt and confusion. She wasn't quite sure how to feel in this situation. However, she felt there was a more pressing matter as she placed a hand on Naruto's shoulder. "Naruto, the blonde just walked away without a word, leaving the mint-haired Jinchuriki to simply blink." She turned to see him stalk over to Shizuku's body, dropping to his knees beside her, and just sitting there. After a moment or two she walked over and joined him, both just sitting in the silence of the clearing, the bodies of their best friend and enemy both lying dead around them. The atmosphere in the command tent was rather light for once. Despite the rebellion being slowly pushed back, the conversation seemed to have shifted onto a more jovial topic. Mei was taking it all in with a smile as she sat back on her seat, a small smile on her face. This was what she fought for, to see her people smiling and happy, joking despite the rough times. She sighed happily as something Chojuro said managed to set Ao off on one of his rants. Really, back in my day you would not only be ineligible for such things, but you would be actively denied from taking part. Really, I didn't think I had become too old that the youth today would know nothing of the traditional ways. There was a brief silence as Meizai twitched violently, a dark aura appearing around her body. Ineligible, denied, too old. She slowly got to her feet however before she could give Ao his usual death threat they all heard some kind of commotion outside the tent. Blinking in surprise Ao immediately activated the Byakugan beneath his eye patch. However, what he saw just had him stood stock still gulping like a fish thrown onto the shore. A minute later they heard a smaller but closer commotion just outside the tent. A minute later when the outside had settled into an eerie calm a figure ducked in under the flaps. Mei sighed internally when she saw it was just Naruto. She was a little miffed that he had simply walked in unannounced though as the guards were there to stop people doing that. However, she immediately noticed something was wrong when Naruto lacked the usual serene smile he always wore. In fact his face was completely devoid of any warmth. It was that moment she noticed the blonde was dragging something behind him, somebody. A moment later the entire command tent was staring at the lifeless body of the Yandere Mizukage as Naruto carelessly tossed his limp form into their midst. A moment later he walked straight back out again without a word, leaving everybody in shocked silence. Chapter 33, Water 9. Fo had to catch herself on the wooden wall again as the floor beneath her feet lurched, nearly throwing her to the floor. For somebody with such a naturally dark and caramel complexion, she looked unusually pale as she staggered through the corridor, constantly having to use a hand to steady herself. She had found out recently that she hated ships, with a passion. The constant rocking motion left her disoriented and dizzy as her stomach churned with nausea. Currently she and Naruto were on a rather large ship traveling from the northeast coast of Mizu no Kuni, around Kaminari no Kuni's peninsula and onward to Tsuchi no Kuni. She moved out onto the deck of the ship with weak legs, doing her best not to tremble slightly. Out here in the fresh air at least she felt a modicum of control return to her limbs, as long as she secured herself with chakra to avoid being thrown around by the rocking waves. She peered up at the bright sun shining down on them overhead, reflecting off the surrounding waters to give everything rather annoying glare. She had to put a hand above her eyes just to peer about the deck, not that there were many people around up here. Sure enough she sighed as she spotted the person she had been looking for. Naruto was where he always was, at least since coming aboard. He stood at the railing, just staring out at the sea with dull, unseeing eyes. He had been this way ever since Shizuko had died. He had barely even spoken a word to anybody. They had left the rebel camp as soon as they had dropped off Yagura's body. Fo figured it was because the camp reminded him too much of all the time he had spent with Shizuko there. They weren't stopped, mostly because everybody was just too shocked that Yagura was dead to do anything. By the time Mei had snapped out of her stupor and made sure the body was in fact the real deal, it was too late to send anybody after them. Between them the two were nearly impossible to track due to their experience in hiding their chakra signatures and Fo's knowledge of covering up trails. She sighed again as she carefully made her way over the deck, eyeing any wet patches warily so that she didn't slip up. She made it over, resting her hands firmly on the railing behind the blonde who didn't even look up to acknowledge her. They stood there for a while in rather awkward silence, Naruto not speaking because he had nothing to say while Fo was silent because she had no idea what to say. It was times like these that fueled her hatred of Takigakure. Maybe if she had a normal childhood, she would know what to do in a situation like this. She sighed again, resting her chin against her forearms uselessly. If only she wasn't so socially awkward, or had taken Naruto's advice and gotten to know some of the rebels. Do you think she would have liked this view? Fo actually blinked in surprise as she looked up, shocked at hearing Naruto's voice for the first time in 2 days. He was usually the instigator of their conversations, but with his recent bout of introversion and her general awkwardness it had been painfully quiet recently. She looked out in the same direction he did, watching the clear blue waves rise and fall, crashing against the bow of the ship. The sight nearly made her lose her lunch as she paled another shade. It depends, would she still like it with dark clouds and constant rain? Unsurprisingly, but still strangely, with Shizuku's death the rain that had followed them for so long finally abated, the skies clearing up as if to acknowledge the girl's death. More surprisingly though, Fu actually saw a small smile pass over Naruto's face, his eyes gaining a hint of melancholy. She had noticed that he hadn't kept his eyes narrowed like he normally did recently. She wasn't sure if it was because he didn't notice, or he simply didn't care anymore. You're right, things would be so different and she was still here, if I had just done something to save her. That small smile slowly slipped away as he returned to staring out at the churning waters. His Shikuju wasn't at his side, more than likely tucked away in Naruto's cabin. It wasn't like it was going to be stolen. Fu looked at the boy for a moment, indecision racking her features before she finally placed a hand on his shoulder. She wasn't good with people, but she had seen Naruto do it to others before, and it seemed to help them. You shouldn't blame yourself, Naruto, she couldn't finish as Naruto suddenly turned on her, finally something other than that horrible dead look he had been wearing in his eyes, anger. Why not? He pulled his shoulder out from under her hand, slamming his fist down on a railing. The anger didn't last long though, it just wasn't like Naruto. Slowly his face returned to one of sadness as he slumped to the deck, back propped up only by the railing. It's my fault, Fu, it's all my fault. If I had been faster, or more in control, maybe if I had sensed them earlier, or had never accepted the mission, if I knew medical ninjutsu. He looked down, his head lolling forward limply. Maybe I could have saved her. Fu hesitated a moment before sitting next to him, both just looking down into their laps. Naruto and Fu stared down at the recently upturned earth in front of them, an almost perfect rectangle of 2 feet by 6 feet. Naruto's robes were covered in dried mud from digging the grave and tears still stained his face, making small streams through the dirt on his cheeks. The shovel he had been holding slowly disintegrated away into black dust, some of it falling on the grave itself. Fu stood on the other side, knowing she should be sad but not finding any tears of her own flowing. She hadn't cried since she was a much smaller girl. I think she would be happy with this. The blonde looked up at her but said nothing. They were standing on a high cliff overlooking the shore. A beach stretched out beneath them, and if it wasn't for the recent rain making the entire area feel drab and dismal, it would have been a picturesque scene. It had stopped raining not long after Naruto had finished patting down the last of the earth, although the two were still drenched. He stood up slowly, making Fu follow him up instinctively, and just stood still for a moment. After a moment of some kind of internal debate, he raised one hand, his fingers moving in a complex and dizzying pattern. The ground at the head of the loose earth bulged before bursting out as sand. It began to stream around, compressing and shaping itself until it formed a large, humanoid figure. Fu blinked in surprise when she found herself staring at a beautiful sand sculpture of Shizuku, complete with her trademark kindly smile. Naruto stepped forward and placed a hand on the statue, closing his eyes as blue flame erupted around the hand. Slowly it spread across the sculpture, covering more and more of it in blue flames until it was one large cerulean inferno. Despite the fire itself giving off no real heat, Fu couldn't help but cringe back slightly and worry for Naruto, who was still just standing there, palm pressed against the Shizuku look-alike. When the bright flames finally abated and Fu could lower her hand, her eyes widened in surprise. Instead of a perfect replica of Shizuku made of sand, there instead stood a white marble version of her. He had used Banbutsu Suzo to shift the very structure of the sand into stone, not even using his chakra rods as a medium. It was incredible, and he didn't even look tired after using it. The mint-haired girl marveled at the perfect likeness in silence. It was perfect to the last detail. Her clothes even appeared wet, and it looked like drops of water clung to her hair. It was exactly as Fu remembered the girl. It's beautiful. Again, Naruto remained silent, staring into the lifeless marble eyes of the girl he had cared so much about, and could do nothing to save. For a moment his eyes flickered down to Yagura's soulless corpse to one side, like an intruder at this private moment. It passed as his sad gaze returned to the memorial to his friend. Over time it would wear away, erode and break apart like any statue exposed to the elements, But not while he was alive, not while he still had chakra left. It's my fault too, you know. The blonde looked up, his head coming up out of his wallowing to briefly glance at Fu. This time she was the one with the far-off look, staring out over the reflective water that glittered in the setting sun. Maybe if I had stayed by her side, not left her alone when she wasn't ready yet. Fu surprised herself, she didn't usually speak much, and that might have been the most she had said in a single sentence in a while. She managed a small smile, it felt alien on her face even now after all this time. At least she was avenged though. At that Naruto looked away, one of his hands clenching into a tight fist that had his knuckles turning white. Because I killed him, because I threw away my beliefs and took his life without even stopping to think first. His shoulders slumped forward as he breathed out, his fist unclenching with the exhale. I'm a monster. He blinked lethargically when Fu suddenly appeared in front of him, legs tucked beneath her as her orange orbs pierced his Rinnegan eyes. Naruto, am I a monster? Despite his depression, Naruto's answer was instinctual, almost bred into him by a need to protect those around him from harm both physical and emotional. Of course, not Fu, you dash. She suddenly pressed a finger to his lips, silencing him as she looked away towards the deck of the ship, suddenly unable to meet his gaze. The first time I killed was when I was 8 years old. Anything else Naruto might have had to say suddenly died on his tongue as his eyes widened. They woke me up earlier than they usually did, pulling me outside to my training ground. There were people there, people I didn't recognize that were all looking at me in ways I didn't understand. Looking back now I think it was pity, or maybe anxiety, I'm not sure. She didn't look up as she talked and her voice was low, a whisper as if divulging a secret that shouldn't be spoken. There was a man there too, he looked injured and beaten up. I was brought in front of him, and told he was an enemy of Takigakure and therefore deserved to die. They put a kunai in my hand and I didn't even tremble. Naruto could see her hand tighten slightly, a look of regret entering her eye, and the only reason he didn't reach out to comfort her was she still had a hand pressed against his lips. I looked at him for only a few moments. He didn't look up, or talk, or do anything. He just knelt there. I think he had accepted it by then. The girl finally looked up, her orange orbs locking with his own again. Do you know what I thought back then? Naruto couldn't move, he was too transfixed by the way Fu was looking at him, her gaze held so much intensity. I thought, which artery do I cut so that blood won't get all over me? She looked down again, her eyes losing that fire and becoming dull again, like when Naruto had first found her in that same training ground. It didn't work. That night I had to sleep in clothes drenched in the man's blood. I was never told his name, or what he did that deserved his death. I never even asked. It wasn't my last kill either. I stopped counting after a while, it just became a number anyway somewhere in the back of my head. I never questioned any of it, just doing it because I didn't want to be punished for disobeying. She looked up again, her eyes steeled as she looked at Naruto. He wondered if she was expecting some kind of reprisal for her words. Am I a monster? Naruto gaped at her speechlessly, mouth struggling to catch up to his mind that was moving a mile a minute. Eventually he shook his head slowly and managed to get a small fleeting smile from the mint-haired Jinchuriki. Then how could you ever be? Naruto opened his mouth to speak again, but found his throat oddly dry, his head slumped forward as he returned to staring at his lap. You don't understand, it was different. His shoulders trembled for a moment as he remembered that moment, where he could literally see Yagura dying right before him. I literally held his soul in my hand, I could feel it, everything that made him who he was, his life, his techniques, his memories, I could feel it all. Fu remembered that, at the time she had thought it was a trick of the light, but she swore she had seen Naruto pull some kind of ghostly, ephemeral being from Yagura's body, accompanied by a sickening tearing noise. Look. He raised a hand, slowly, lazily even, he drew a large circle in the air, and before Fu's very eyes a large, perfectly clear mirror appeared out of thin air, created entirely from water. That was his technique. I didn't even know it existed before fighting him, and now I feel as if I have been practicing it all of my life. Everything he did, all those horrible, unspeakable acts against humanity. He looked up, eyes dull and lifeless. They're inside me now. Fu widened her eyes slightly. It sounded horrible, yet at the same time hugely beneficial. To have all the experience of a Kage in mere moment was just unreal. Is it? She trailed off, unsure of how to ask without sounding as though she was prying. After a moment Naruto nodded slowly. Yeah, it's another path, the human path. Naruto gained a faraway look as he spoke. He had never imagined one of his abilities could be that way. That what is dash she was cut off as Naruto sighed loudly. Please Fu, I don't want to talk about it right now. Fu paused before nodding submissively. It was what she was good at after all. But to be honest, Naruto really didn't want to talk about it. If he could, he wouldn't even be thinking about it. Just remembering how Yagura's soul felt in his hand, so cold yet filled with life at the same time. His memories were still there, his thoughts and experiences, just beneath the surface. They were suppressed by Naruto's own consciousness, so only the things he wanted bled through. Eventually the silence up on the deck became too much. Naruto had finally started talking again, and he really didn't want it to go away so soon. Fu? The green-haired girl looked up expectantly, glad that Naruto wasn't completely shutting her out again. While she was poor with social skills, she still craved the attention and warmth of others like any other human. She just didn't understand exactly why. What if it changes me? What if I become like him and I change? He nearly jumped when he felt Fu's hand gently rest on his shoulder, meekly raising his eyes to look at her again. Do you feel different? Naruto raised a hand to argue, but Fu's penetrating stare made him falter. But later Fu's glare only increased in intensity, and Naruto found anything else he had to say evaporating. Do you feel any different? Naruto could only maintain eye contact with her for another few moments before looking down. No. This time Fu gently raised his head with a finger under his arm, a soft smile that was rarely seen on her face crossing her lips. You are still Naruto, and until you decide otherwise nobody and nothing can change that. The blonde blinked rapidly for a second. He had never heard Fu say anything so profound before. He wondered where it came from. Yagura was an evil man. The things he did will probably never be forgiven by those they affected. Many people would see you as a hero for killing him. Naruto's shoulders slumped again as his head lolled forward. But is that an excuse for taking his life away? I killed him out of revenge. Now people will look to me in revenge for his death, and if they killed me then somebody would go after them in revenge again. It's an endless, horrible cycle of hatred and revenge that has no end and will ultimately consume humanity if somebody doesn't stop it. He raised his hands up, placing them on his forehead as his brow furrowed into a deep frown. But humanity is what it is. The cycle has gone on for so long and not even the original sage could stop it. What can I do? He felt Fu settle down next to him, her warm body pressed up against his from the side as she stared out over the sea. You don't need to come up with an answer just yet. You have your whole life still for that. For now, just give yourself time to grieve and move on, find a new happiness, new friends. Naruto looked up, eyes widened in shock as he stared at Fu's green tresses from the side. Move on? Fu's mouth set into a soft smile, if only for a moment, before she turned to meet him, managing to give him a small blush at how close their faces were all of a sudden. Shizuka once told me you made her a promise that she would never have to cry again. What makes you think she would want to see you the same way? Naruto looked down, remembering some of the girl's last words to him as she wiped the tears from his eyes. But I broke that promise, I couldn't protect her. He looked up again, startled as Fu suddenly rested her head on his shoulder. It was a little awkward, but she had seen boys and girls do this in some towns they passed through, and they seemed to be happy. She thought it might help. No, you didn't. Did she once cry after that? Naruto tried to think back to that moment, despite the pain he felt in his heart as he did so, but sure enough, he couldn't remember Shizuka crying even a little as she died. He sighed wearily, his body going slightly limp against the railing, and looked up at the sky which was beginning to darken as the sun dipped below the horizon behind them. Fu. The girl looked up, her bright orange eyes looking up at him in a way that despite the situation was undeniably cute. Thank you. Her face remained the same as she gave a small nod, noticing the tiny smile at the corner of the blonde's lips. We're friends, aren't we? Naruto simply nodded. Naruto sat in his cabin breathing slowly and deeply. It was a week's trip by boat ride from Mizu no Kuni to Tsuchi no Kuni, and they were currently on the third day. He had finally gotten out of the depressed air he had assumed since Shizuku's death, and although he was still saddened in mourning her, everything seemed a little clearer now. For one, he realized he probably shouldn't have left the rebels like that, without a word. He especially felt bad for not even speaking to Nezumiro after everything the four of them had been through. She probably didn't even know Shizuku was dead. He simply resolved to see her again, which got him to thinking about what the rebels were doing now. Without the Mizukage, he could guess that Kiri was currently panicking. No doubt Mei would take advantage of that. It almost made him laugh that when he had entered Mizu no Kuni he hadn't even known what to expect, or how to help. Yet, in the end, he was the one who took down the Mizukage. For all he knew, the rebellion was over and Kirigakure was in Mei's hands now. He had always heard people calling her the future Godame, as if it was a certainty. Now at least it was. He shook his head, once again trying to clear his thoughts of any and all distractions as he calmed his breathing and his slightly erratic chakra flow. With his time in the rebellion, he had never had all that much time to simply sit back and meditate. He had changed a lot from the monk he had been setting out from the fire temple. Right now, he was trying to find his roots again. It wouldn't do for him to return to the temple only to find nobody recognized him anymore. Absently he blew a stray bang of hair from his face. He really needed to get it cut soon. Suddenly though, he felt a familiar tug and released himself to it. He grimaced at the sight around him. If he had thought these hallways looked bad after assimilating Matatabi, it had nothing on this. Corrosive chakra leaked in almost steady streams from the new pipeline on the ceiling, burning through the floor, but luckily without the acrid stench. He grimaced slightly. Having been mostly ignoring the pain running through his body, he had been too numbed by Shizuku's death to even care at the time. Right now, though, he realized that allowing himself to burn from the inside out wouldn't really be productive, not to mention Shizuku would probably admonish him. He almost smiled at the thought before reining it in and focusing intently on his own chakra system. Around him, unnoticed due to his eyes being clenched shut in concentration, the pipes fixed themselves like they were being reversed in time. Rust creeped back before vanishing altogether, and new rivets materialized to keep the structure together. When he opened his eyes, he no longer felt the dull burn like acid in his veins, and the corridor around him was gradually healing from the damage he had allowed to occur. It would take a while to heal completely, but he seemed to at least get the new chakra source under control. Speaking of which, he frowned as he made his way to the large chamber holding his various tenants. As expected, it had remolded itself to accommodate the newcomer, having become a heptagon with the new gate between Matatabis and the Cubis. However, the new tenant seemed less than pleased to be there. The Sanbai was roaring madly as it repeatedly bashed its tails against the somewhat weakening bars of its cell. With some panic, Naruto realized that the seal was still quite weak from the transfer, and all the time he had allowed the new corrosive chakra free rein in his system. Stop. His voice was surprisingly strong, managing to drown out the beast's roar for a moment, only to go completely ignored as the beast continued to thrash against the bars. I said stop. Once again his cry went unanswered, the giant turtle still bashing manically against its jail. Stop. This time it did stop. It was forced to as a sudden blast of invisible force sent it skidding back into the darkness of its cell. Thankfully, Naruto noticed the bars had immediately begun to repair themselves as he increased his chakra in the seal. However, not a moment later the Three Tails took the opportunity to charge the cell with surprising speed for a creature its size, no to mention it didn't look like the most mobile of animals outside of water. It hit the metal with a sickening screech as the steel bent back under the assault. Once again Naruto sent the enraged turtle back with a Shinra Tensei, this time preventing it from getting any closer than a few feet so it couldn't continue this assault. Now that he had prevented the bijou from harming the seal anymore, he could get a good look at it. His memories from after Shizuka died up until he saw Yagura die were crystal clear. but seeing the beast while in a rage, and seeing it when he was calm allowed him to observe a few more things. For some reason or another one of its eyes seemed permanently closed, but that wasn't what caught his gaze first. No, what he saw were the three tomo spinning angrily on a red background, circling an equally black dot of a pupil. It was an eye that he knew all too well, an eye that had haunted his dreams from a young age in the fire temple. He froze for a moment, but only until another loud and enraged roar snapped him out of it. He immediately rushed forward, slamming his hands onto the bars of the cage and channeling as much chakra as he could muster into them. Immediately the various dents and scraped fixed themselves, the bars looking pristine as if they were new. However, at the same time the sandbai began to thrash about violently, its singular eye darting about in a crazed, panicking manner. Then, suddenly, the Sharingan dissipated, simply leaving the creature's normal red eye ringed with a single golden band. When Naruto saw this, he backed off from the bars, panting from the exertion of using enough chakra to fully invade a Bijuu's system. He had just used the second method of releasing a genjutsu, a timed burst of his own chakra in the afflicted system. It turned out though that the timed burst was enough chakra to have most Kage on their knees from the strain. If Naruto wasn't currently in the seal and this body was actually real, he might have collapsed. As it was, he simply needed to take a few deep breaths. The sandbai on the other hand didn't appear to be as lucky. It seemed to take a few confused glances around the room with its one working eye before it closed, the beast collapsing into exhaustion. Naruto took a few steps back on still rather shaky legs, before sitting down in a very messy cross-legged position that would have had any of his senpai from the temple lightly smacking him on the back of his head. What was that? He looked around to see Shikako looking at him nervously, his large clawed hands ringing around one another, a comical sight if not for the situation. He continued to glance around, spotting Matatabi predictably asleep, having blissfully slept through the entire ordeal. Finally, his eyes rested on the Kyuubi, his body hidden away in the darkness of his cell with his eyes cracked open, and an unpleasant snarl on his muzzle. That Ningen was the Sharingan, the unfortunate bastardization of the sage's prized eyes. For centuries those damnable eyes have haunted us Bijuu, ever since the first Uchiha awoke them. Naruto managed to catch his breath as he sat there, watching the Kyuubi's eyes bore into the sandbai cell, either in contempt or disgust he couldn't tell, perhaps both. That's right, you can be controlled, can't you? The glare he was sent by the mighty fox was positively murderous as it walked over, bringing its body into the light. I am controlled by nothing, Ningen. Naruto just nodded absently, getting a highly irritated and menacing grunt from the fox. So, the sandbai was being controlled? By who? That seemed to placate the fox, or at least redirect its infinite rage onto something other than the small blonde monk. It's unmistakable, the stench of Uchiha Madara permeates the air around Isabo. Naruto filed away the sandbai's name for later as he turned his attention back to the great fox. Madara? I thought you said he died. The fox grunted again as he lay its head down on its paws in the classic manner. If only the cursed genjutsu of the Sharingan were so easy to break, I would never have fallen under that damn Ningen's. The fox trailed off and Naruto knew he had been about to say control before he caught himself. In any case, a genjutsu able to enthrall a Bijuu would naturally be strong enough to last beyond the user's death, that is, if Madara Uchiha is in fact dead. Naruto raised an eyebrow at that in confusion, looking to the Kyuubi for clarification. If there was any of you Ningen able to slip by the Shinigami, it would certainly be that man, although he would be a frail old man by now. The thought seemed to bring a rather vicious smirk to the Kyuubi's face, obviously picturing his greatest enemy as a withered husk of his former self was quite satisfying. Suddenly though the fox turned, its slitted crimson eyes glaring at the young blonde before him with a newfound malice. Regardless, there is the matter of you forcibly stealing my chakra, Ningen. The fox's great maw leaned even closer to the bars of the cage with another grin. Do you not think that validates compensation? A chill ran through Naruto's body as he stared up at those malicious red eyes, staring down at him expectantly. Chapter 34, Earth Eye. Compensation? The Kyuubi's grin widened as it somehow manages to move his face even closer to the bars of his cell, one of his clawed paws pressing against the metal. Simple, release me from the seal and allow me to tear your body apart quickly and all will be forgiven. Naruto blinked once before staring at the fox blankly for a few seconds. The strange thing was that he understood that the fox killing him swiftly as opposed to with excruciating prejudice was actually a concession on the Kyuubi's part. You're a terrible negotiator for creature supposed to be sly and cunning. The fox growled, but Naruto knew by now it was half-hearted. It was odd to think of the mighty Bijou as joking. Anyway, I have no idea how I would release you at all. I assume it's not quite as simple as just forcing all of your chakra out of my body. He knew that wouldn't work. Such a thing would tear apart his chakra network and probably paralyze him for life, if it didn't just outright kill him. Actually, you could release any of us in the same manner as father did originally. Everybody's attention turned to Matatabi, who had just awoken, stretching out like any feline did after waking from a nap, small or large, or in this case very large. Naruto just responded with a very eloquent nod that showed he had no idea what she was talking about. After the great flaming cat had settled, still luckily awake for now, she sighed. Father used the Banbutsu Suzu to create us bodies, and then allowed our chakra to seep into them slowly over a time. Naruto blinked. He hadn't thought of that, mostly because he had never considered using the sage's most powerful technique to create a living, breathing body. He heard a grunt from the Kyuubi's cage and turned to see the fox had adopted a similar position to his sister. A ninja like him could never master the technique to that degree, he cannot even perform it correctly. Naruto quashed his annoyance at being spoken about like he wasn't there in favor of curiosity. What do you mean not doing it correctly? The fox just snorted and closed his eyes dismissively, making the blonde sigh. He should know better than to think the Kyuubi would ever willingly help him. He means you are only using half of the technique's full potential. The Nibby was met by a loud growl from the fox that merely went ignored by the flaming feline. Telling would be cheating, but to understand you have to know more about how chakra works and what it is composed of. With that, the great cat Bijou closed her eyes, yawning loudly as if she hadn't already been asleep for a few days. Naruto on the other hand merely sighed. It all came back to chakra, the very reason he left the temple in the first place. He looked at the Sanbai again. It was still unconscious, so he would have to come back later for answers, but the whole affair with the Sharingan I had left him rather startled. It brought up a lot of very painful memories he thought he had gotten over, but apparently, he couldn't bring himself to truly get over Ayame and Tucci. He sighed as he looked around again, noticing that Shikaku was oddly quiet, and was still wringing his hands in that strange way. He had never seen the giant Tanuki so reserved before. It was like the Kyuubi acting submissive, just unsettling. Father? Naruto walked over to the cage, noting that the Kyuubi's eye had cracked open slightly to observe, but he ignored it. Yes, Shikaku? The sand construct ducked down to his normal position with his head close to the bars of the cell so he could look Naruto closer to the eye. Shikaku felt father was angry and sad. Shikaku sent his sand to help because Shikaku doesn't like when father is sad. Did Shikaku help? Naruto blinked in shock at this odd new side to the Ichibi. It was like he was worried for Naruto. He had thought the Tanuki was merely insane, overlapping his feelings for the sage onto him due to his eyes and, if what he kept saying was anything to go by, his appearance. He remembered clearly the point in his fight when Yagura had been about to impale him with all three of his tails before the sand rose up to stop it without any prompting. Yes, Shikaku, you helped a lot. A soft smile came over his face as he stared up at the now happy features of the enormous Bijou. It was strange to think that he could no longer see Shikaku as the immense being of destruction he was hailed as. It was just too outside of the personality he had seen. In many ways it was a lot like the Tanuki really was a child of sorts, although he wouldn't go as far as to say he was Shikaku's father. Shikaku will always protect father just like father protected Shikaku. The being gained a proud grin on his jagged mouth before ducking down as Naruto reached a hand through the bars of his cage. Naruto made sure to rub extra vigorously on the Ichibi's sandy head, just to make sure Shikaku knew his efforts were appreciated, even if he probably could have healed from anything Yagura inflicted by that point. He once again left the seal with a satisfied feeling, with all 4 bijou currently housed inside of him laying down. 2 in unconscious stupors, 1 taking a nap and the other simply faking as he watched the events with a single slitted red eye. However, the satisfaction was tinged by a few problems that would be racking his brain for the next few days. As usual from his conversations with his tenants, he was left with far more questions than answers. The boat was approaching the end of its journey to Tsuchi no Kuni, and so were its passengers. They had to make a brief stop in Yuki no Kuni for supplies, which gave Naruto and Fu an hour or 2 to look around the snow-filled port town they stopped off in. It seemed like a nice place, if not too cold, and a little quiet for Naruto's tastes, and that was coming from a monk. It hadn't lasted long though, and soon they had continued on their journey to the home of Iwagakure. Naruto had noticed that their brief supply stop seemed to cause problems with a few of the other passengers. After he had gotten out of his depressed stupor, he had been informed that the ship was carrying a film crew on it, quite the prestigious one too. Apparently, Yuki Fujikase herself was aboard, although she had refused to come out from the lower decks while the boat was anywhere near Yuki no Kuni. Naruto hadn't really paid it any mind, everybody was entitled to their own secrets, although his natural curiosity regarding why an actress would be so distressed about a particular country had been piqued. Ultimately though, it was more of an inconvenience than it was interesting. Every so often during the trip various areas of the ship would be cordoned off. Apparently, the director wanted them for various scenes in the movie, and the captain was more than happy to comply on the off chance it would bring more business to his ship. Naruto simply found it irritating when he wasn't allowed to go up on deck in case he interrupted a scene. When he had told them he could become invisible and therefore wouldn't disrupt anything, they had just looked at him strangely. However, the worst thing was the last night on the boat when a sudden inspiration hit the director, and he had practically demanded he be allowed to shoot a scene inside Fu's room, meaning the green-haired girl had to spend the night with him. It didn't help that when he insisted on taking the floor, Fu had simply joined him anyway. Apparently, his body heat was much more pleasant than the thin blankets provided by the ship. It was an awkward night for him, although Fu seemed to enjoy herself if the soft smile she wore the next morning was any indication. The blonde didn't really have an issue with Fu sleeping near him, he actually rather enjoyed the company. It was just the fact it reminded him of the nights he had spent with Shizuku which led to him reminiscing and ultimately getting less sleep than he would have liked. On that vein, by the time they arrived at the shore of Tsuchi no Kuni, Naruto had lost enough sleep that he had begun to gain black rings around his eyes that would make Gaara proud. As the boat pulled into the harbor of the astoundingly large port town they had entered into, Naruto could be found sitting in a meditative position up on the top deck, towards the stern of the ship, or at least that was how Fu found him. The ships arrived in Ketsugen Maki. All she got from the blonde was a curt nod, his face maintaining that same look of absolute calm, laced with concentration. She noticed the air around the monk seemed damper than normal, which was strange considering they had been out at sea for the past week. Honestly, Fu was just glad to be getting back onto dry land where the floor wouldn't keep moving beneath her. Flight she could handle quite well, in fact, the sea and anything to do with water transport, not so much. I know, I can feel it. Naruto finally opened his eyes, releasing a small breath he hadn't realized he had been holding. The Yondaime Mizukage, while a despicable and terrible man, certainly was powerful, and his techniques reflected that. His ability to sense everything around him using water chakra laced through the air was a startlingly useful ability. Naruto sort of imagined it was close to what a Byakugan user saw when using their Dojutsu, except it was probably closer to echolocation. Of course, Naruto's water affinity was not nearly as strong as Yagura's, so he could so far only stretch his senses out around 200 meters while sitting still. However, within that range Naruto could detect everything in a similar way to how he could feel chakra signatures through his sand. He had felt Fu approaching him as soon as she had left her bed. It wasn't the clearest picture, more like a fuzzy outline at best, but he could also feel her chakra signature. The technique was also weak where there was less water vapor in the air, but on a ship out at sea that wasn't really an issue. Alright, let's go. Fu nodded happily, he had noticed that since he had come out of his own depressed shell, Fu seemed to open up more around him emotionally. He couldn't be sure if she was doing it in an attempt to comfort him, or she felt some kind or guilt at Shizuku's death. Either Naruto rather liked the change from the normally expressionless kunoichi to a more relatable teenage girl. The two quickly made their way off the ship, noting that the film crew wasn't far behind them. It made Naruto wonder what film the director could be shooting if he had to come to Earth Country. It wasn't exactly known as the most aesthetically pleasing place. Either way, he ignored them as the two set off into the rather large town that was famous for its fishing industry and shale export. It was a veritable trading hub that Iwagakure regularly capitalized on. They liked to use it as a base to send their shinobi teams off on their long-distance missions, at a discount from the captains, of course, due to the protection the shinobi offered. After 10 minutes, Naruto realized he had been relatively lost in his thoughts as the two aimlessly wandered through the town. Fu, of course, had been obediently following him, naturally trusting him wherever he was going, as she had been since Taki. He stopped in the middle of the streets, only Fu's advanced shinobi-trained senses preventing her from walking straight into his back. He looked around, noting they had entered some kind of shopping district before making a beeline for the nearest cafe. A few minutes later and Naruto was quite happily sipping on some tea, while Fu was content with water. It was something Naruto found amusement in given her aversion to sea travel. He sighed as he leaned back in the seat, idly glancing around at the people eating and drinking around them. He saw families and couples, men that looked like they were waiting for business partners of maybe clients, all together in one place. So, what now? Fu had remained quiet up until this point, but she had finally voiced the thought that had been plaguing Naruto for the last few minutes. Finally, with slightly frustrated sigh, he leaned back forward, staring despondently into his tea. I'm not sure. He rolled his neck once, noting that he had somehow drawn the attention of a few older patrons in the cafe. I would recommend going to IWA and working on earth manipulation, but honestly my master warned me of that. Apparently, I bear too much of a resemblance to the Yondaime Hokage, and it might not be safe for me. Naruto quietly sighed at the thought. At the start of his journey, he might have paid no heed to those words. After all, he was a monk. He had faith in humanity to look past such petty things as physical appearance or resemblance. Of course, his journeys had enlightened him in a way. Now he was sure that people accosting him purely for looking like a man who had simply done his job in service of his country was perfectly possible. The thought wasn't exactly welcome in his idealistic mind, but it was definitely there. He now realized that humanity simply had a darker side he could no longer blissfully ignore. This realization had of course been a product of fighting in a horrendous war built on the back of paranoia and ignorance. Is there anywhere else you could learn earth manipulation? Naruto paused for a moment as his gaze returned to Fu, his eyes focusing intently on the girl for a few moments as a few thoughts ran through his mind. Why are you following me, Fu? The girl looked genuinely startled at the question, her large orange eye widening in surprise. What do you mean? Naruto sighed wearily as he resumed staring into his cup of tea, watching as the distorted reflection of the sky wobbled as he moved the cup. What do you gain from being with me? So far I have nearly put you in trouble with Kumogakure and dragged you into a civil war you could have died in. He looked up, sadness brimming his rippled eyes. I don't want you to follow me to your death, Fu. The mint-haired girl relaxed slightly, exhaling in relief. She had thought Naruto was abandoning her honestly, she wasn't sure she could take that. It would most likely shatter what little emotional stability she had left. Like Shizuku? Naruto visibly flinched at her unintentionally accusing tone that wasn't really directed at him. He refused to meet her gaze as her eyes continued to bore into the side of his head, tracing the outlines of his spiky locks. Naruto, what happened to Shizuku was not your fault. Again, his eyes refused to come up and meet hers. She chose to follow you because you saved her from a life infinitely more terrible than anything else. She followed you because she saw something in you that made her want to follow you. If you're at fault, it's for just being an amazing person who would think about others before himself. Finally, Naruto's head raised a little, his eyes peering up curiously. Then why do you follow me? He saw a soft smile alight on the Jinchuriki's lips. Naruto had to admit she looked incredibly cute like that. Because while I didn't see that same quality at first, you were there for me long enough that I was able to. Her smile took on a more melancholic hint, but her eyes never strayed from his. For that alone I will continue to follow you, no matter what you say. Finally, a small smile tweaked the edges of the blonde's lips as he sat a little straighter in his chair. Thanks, Fo. He sighed deeply and drank down the rest of his tea. It's good to know I have a real friend with me. The mint-haired girl simply nodded with a rather satisfied smile on her features as she casually sipped at her glass of water. Although that doesn't really help with where we're supposed to go next. Fo cocked her head slightly, her eyes drifting away lazily in thought. There may be a library with earth manipulation techniques in Tsuchi no Kuni's capital? The mint-haired girl shrugged slightly as she talked. She was grasping at straws as much as Naruto was. The blonde could only return the shrug in kind as he scooted his chair back and stood up, allowing Fo to down her water as they left the cafe. It's worth a shot. I think IWA should be a last resort. Fo nodded. It wasn't hard for her to spot the resemblance between Naruto and Minato Namikaze. She had been taught about many of the previous powerful Kage and other notable shinobi as part of her training. Usually, it involved strategic exercises on how to counter many of their more famous techniques. However, there was no known counter for the Hiraishin no Jutsu, part of what made the Yondaime Hokage so formidable. He could literally kill you before you had even begun to realize he was there. In fact, many of the old legends of the shinobi world, those like Madara Uchiha, the Shodaime Hokage, the Nidaime Tsuchikage and Mizukage and the Sandaime Reikage were still recognized as the most powerful shinobi to ever live, including those alive today. Many of their techniques were still puzzled on and people found themselves hard-pressed to come up with counters many years after their deaths. In each case it had taken them either killing each other, in the case of the first four, or simply overwhelming force, in the case of the Sandaime Reikage, for them to finally be defeated. I agree. The two once again moved through the village, this time with purpose as they made their way west. Still, with only the jingle of Naruto's Shikuja breaking the silence between them, it became rather awkward. It made Naruto miss the idle chatter Shizuku could always come up with, or the various strange noises Marsura would make. The little Capuchin had disappeared sometime after Shizuku's death, or maybe Naruto had simply forgotten him in his depressed haze. Either way, he somewhat missed the little presence perched on the end of his staff. Their small moment of peace couldn't last long though, as Naruto felt a multitude of signatures slowly begin to surround them. Their chakra levels, from what he could detect through the air and through the ground, definitely put them as shinobi, but not particularly powerful. If he had to guess, he would say they were a squad of relatively new chunin. He looked over to see Fo's eyes looking around slightly more attentively than before. It seemed she had noticed as well. Naruto sighed and turned into a nearby alleyway, intentionally drawing out whoever was following them. Look what we got here, boys. Another small sigh escaped the blonde's lips as 6 men, barely over 20, dropped down from the nearby roofs. A moment later he quirked an eyebrow as he looked up at one of the roofs, before returning his attention back to the men, adopting his kindly monk persona with his eyes narrowed and a serene smile on his face. Can I help you, Shinobi-san? Fo had to suppress a scoff as she stood back boredly. This was a boy who had single-handedly taken down a Kage, a Jinchuriki no less, and he was being polite with a bunch of ruffian chunin. The poor fools had no idea what they were playing with here. They never even noticed as a small wall of sand appeared at either end of the alleyway, blocking it off from the rest of the town. Yeah, I suppose you could. The leader of the bunch, as there always was, sneered contemptuously at the small blonde. He was a fairly unimpressive man with lank black hair scraped back into a very small top knot and small beady black eyes. The rest were just as forgettable, each wearing the standard IWA uniform of a dull earthen flak jacket and the single-sleeved tunic beneath it. With some curiosity the monk noted that the girl near the back of the group seemed decidedly more nervous than the others, anxiously fumbling with her hands. You see, my companion happened to notice a certain monk walking around that bore a rather striking resemblance to the Yondaime Hokage. The man sneered again in a rather unpleasant manner that Naruto only raised his brow briefly. Rather annoyed his intimidation hadn't worked, the shinobi continued. You know who that is, right? The monster that butchered thousands of IWA shinobi in the Third Great Shinobi War? Naruto raised his other brow to match the first before sighing visibly. I would call it narrow-minded to consider a shinobi killing people monster-like behavior, but I can understand how it may appear that way. Of course, forgetting that it happened during a war where multiple Konoha shinobi also died as well is rather ignorant. The man blinked for a moment, as did a few of his companions, before a nasty look crossed over their features, the first already reaching for a kunai. Are you calling me an idiot? Naruto smiled softly, catching more than a few of the shinobi off guard with the kindly gesture. Of course not, ignorance is very different from stupidity. Ignorance would be attacking me merely for a resemblance to a man simply doing his duty to protect his village, as any loyal IWA shinobi would have done in his place or situation. His smile never left his face as he spoke, but his eyes took on a decidedly harder glint as he looked up at the leader of the group, not that the man could see that stupidity would be attacking me at all. While his first words seemed to give all the shinobi pause, especially the kunoichi at the back, the last one seemed to send the men over the edge. Why, you little brat? The man pulled out his kunai only for it to immediately fly from his hand, straight into Naruto's awaiting palm. The blonde looked at it curiously for a moment as the other shinobi stopped, amazed by whatever Naruto had done. Did you know the kunai was never originally a weapon? Simply a multi-purpose tool? It was ninja that turned something used for manual labor and levering into a method of killing. The blonde sighed as the IWA Nin seemed to regain their composure, irked at Naruto's lecturing tone. Humans are so good at that it make me wonder how we survived for so long being as self-destructive as we are. He absently tossed the small weapon to the side just as another slid into the lead shinobi's hand. Tensai, maybe we should dash. The kunoichi flinched as the leader of the group turned to her with an angry glare. Shut up, Manabe, we need to teach this disrespectful brat a lesson. The kunoichi faltered under the man's gaze. She personally was perfectly fine with leaving the boy alone, even if he did bear a startling resemblance to the Yellow Flash. It was that way with many IWA residents. They had moved on, or at least they had understood the very points the young monk was trying to get across. Still, Tensai was her captain, and she would be charged for insubordination if she refused to at least follow him. Luckily, as the teen medic, she was under no obligation to fight, something she greatly appreciated only a few minutes later. When the first IWA shinobi rushed in, a rather stout man that was obviously not expecting much resistance from a young monk based on his poorly executed jab, it was like a switch had been flicked. Moments before the man was anywhere close to hitting Naruto, the boy had already slipped into his stance. He slid around the punch, dropping between the man's legs in an impressive display of flexibility before flipping him gently so he came to a rolling stop on the ground. Naruto stood back up, the IWA Chunin did not. He was almost completely drained of chakra. Fu smiled involuntarily at the sight. She hadn't seen Naruto use that style for a while. During the war he had favored the more aggressive, but equally non-lethal, Kaminari no Mai. It was better for dealing with multiple opponents, as long as they could actually get close to Naruto, which was a rarity in itself. In this case she knew Naruto was strictly using taijutsu, so that the shinobi had nothing strange to report when they went back to their commanding officer. He was most likely using the Mizu no Mai, so there would be no visible evidence of actual conflict, lessening his chances there would be reprisals against him for assaulting IWA shinobi. Mari. Another of the men rushed forward, this time not underestimating the young blonde as he came forward with a much more disciplined sweeping kick, for all the good it did him. Naruto simply dived at the man, redirecting the two quick punches aimed at his face with well-timed slaps before simply grabbing the man's head. In a few moments the man was unconscious, lacking the chakra to even stay awake. Naruto had found via experimentation that his Preta path not only worked better through direct contact, but by aiming in an area with one of the Hashiman, the celestial gates that regulated mass chakra flow, he could drain a normal shinobi in a few seconds. Further conflict can be avoided if you simply take your comrades and leave my friend and me alone. All he received were 3 glares and a rather meek look from the kunoichi, who was astounded by the skill shown from the young blonde. "Damn you brat, I'll teach you to mess with Iwagakure." Naruto only sighed, not bothering to point out that they had been the ones to strike first, knowing his words would fall on deaf ears. This time 2 of them moved forward at the same time, their similar features possibly making them brothers or twins, as if numerical superiority might give them an edge. Naruto quickly put down that idea as he deftly spun underneath the first blow, redirecting the force of the punch downwards to offset the man's balance. He used the man as leverage to flip over him, avoiding a similar attack from the brother as he planted a hand on the back of the first. Using that as a base, he performed a one-handed handstand, simultaneously draining the man beneath him so that by the time he landed behind the second brother he dropped to the floor, exhausted. By the time the second one turned, Naruto had already gracefully followed the movement, staying behind the man as he grabbed the back of his head. It was always the best place for his Preta path due to the presence of 2 gates, the Kaimon and Kyumon. Ao had been surprisingly helpful when he was unraveling these oddities with his Preta path, explaining the location, function, and various uses of the gates. There were a few members of the rebellion that could actually open a few, no more than the third though, who also proved to be informative. Naruto had yet to actually delve into opening any of the gates, but it was definitely something for him to ponder later. Back to the fight though, if you could call it that, and the leader of the group who had hung back until now saw the folly in attacking Naruto. However, he made a mistake in assuming that Fu was the weaker of the 2, she was, but that didn't make her weaker than him. A few seconds later saw the man on the ground, clutching at his eyes in agony before Naruto promptly walked over and finished the job. He looked up, not even looking remotely winded as 5 Iwa Chunin lay on the floor, all of them completely incapacitated without so much as a scratch. He specifically looked at the kunoichi, who looked back with a mixture of fear and awe. Naruto really didn't like that look, it disturbed him somewhat to think people might actually fear him when he meant no harm. "You are welcome to tend to your teammates if we can leave in peace." The kunoichi seemed hesitant, technically by attacking her comrades, despite them initiating, he was her enemy. Yet at the same time she both had no wish to fight and knew she was completely outclassed here. With a small nod she quickly scurried over to the nearest of her unconscious teammates, allowing Naruto and Fu to calmly walk out of the alleyway, nobody noticing as the walls of sand dispersed harmlessly. A few minutes later and Naruto stopped, purposefully looking up at a nearby rooftop. Moments later and from that very spot a man jumped down, landing solidly in a horse stance. Fu could tell just by the way he moved he was both powerful and well-trained, a jounin at least, nothing like the Chunin back there. If this came down to a fight she wasn't sure Naruto could get by purely on taijutsu. "Ha, pretty good gaki, not a lot of people can detect me when I don't want to be found." Naruto calmly observed the man in the moments he could. He seemed friendly enough, but he was obviously a shinobi, and lying was kind of in their job description. He was an average-sized man with spiky maroon hair done up in a bristly ponytail with a messy mustache and beard. He wore a rather simple purple kimono top with brown armor slung over, reminiscent of the older armor of the first shinobi wore. The most notable feature was the wooden headpiece tapered into a 3-point crown, and a black piece of molded metal running across his nose. "Can we help you, Shinobi-san?" Resuming his peaceful monk routine seemed rather pointless given that the man had been watching him fight those Iwa shinobi, but Naruto rather liked to act that way. Sometimes he could just lose himself in the role and actually pretend he was just a normal monk for once. Oh, how he wished that was true sometimes. "I don't know yet, why don't we walk for a while?" Naruto shrugged and the man gestured a specific direction, away from the town. It was where Naruto and Fu were going anyway, so the small blonde agreed. "I'm Naruto Uzumaki, my companion is Fu." The stout redhead nodded his acknowledgement as they walked, not breaking stride for a moment as they passed the boundary of the town. "You can call me Roshi." That's it for this reading. Hit like and subscribe for a free ticket pass going to the different worlds of anime fanfictions. Looking forward to having you on board again.